figured out that if you ask people the right questions, you can get literally anything custom made. And so,
I still have to order my corgis. I
during the
forgot.
pandemic, and like that's a true story for a site that's way too big to ever be down. And when you hear these stories and then you ask them what they're doing, you like look at the code, you're like, okay, but if you just like any prepackaged CDN would do what you're asking for and never ever run that risk.
Planet scale is a whole category of problems I used to care way too much about. Like I used to be a database nerd and cared all about the different ways to scale your DBs and your infrastructure. And I was tired of it. I wanted to focus on video and like helping my creators on ping be as successful as possible.
How do you feel if somebody gives you a problem and says like, I want you to make this thing perfect, right? Because if you tell me that my whole job is the last 10%, I'm immediately going to not take that job.
Howdy, howdy. So excited for the guest that we have today. I'm sure the vast majority of people here already know who you are, but if you wouldn't mind, give us a quick intro, Jason.
Sure. I'm JLengstorf. I am the host of Learn with Jason. I'm the VP Developer Experience at Netlify. I doof around on the internet, talk about smash burgers and corgis and, you know, all that good stuff. And I'm here to, I guess, defend myself or defend JAMStack, defend JAMStack's honor.
So excited for it. I definitely have been a JAMStack developer, whether or not I'll acknowledge the term, but that's not the only way I've been walking in your wake for years now. I'd love to start first and foremost by talking a bit about your experience as a creator on the platform, specifically like as one of the first people doing software dev streams on Twitch. Like, want to tell us a bit more about your streams and how you got started?
Yeah. So when I first joined Gatsby, we didn't really have like formal DevRel. So I used to joke that my role there was, my title was like human duct tape. And I have always sort of been the person that spots a problem and then I'll just gravitate toward that and try to get it sorted and then wander off to find the next problem. And at Gatsby, what we were running into was this sort of DevRel. We knew we had a strong developer community. We knew we wanted to do a better job of engaging them, but we didn't know how. And so I took on a couple things. One of them was the every contributor, every merge PR would automatically get swag and an invite to the repo, which I don't know if they still do that. But so I built out all that automation. And then I was also like, well, how do we boost transparency? It feels like that's a really important thing for an open source company. So maybe I'll just live stream stuff. So I started inviting anybody who wanted to join our planning meetings over Zoom. And then I was like, this isn't working. This is chaos. Okay, how about I live stream them instead? So I got on Twitch and started live streaming meetings, which nobody cared about like at all. And then I was like, okay, well, what else would work for this? So then people started asking me questions like, I want to build this type of site with Gatsby or that type of site. And so I did a couple pair programming sessions live. And that was the very early where I was like, oh, okay, this is good. Like, this is something that I think is valuable that people would enjoy. But I didn't like that I was asking people who were learning to make themselves vulnerable. Like they had to come in and say, I don't know something. And in order to get information, I have to basically put myself out in public and say, I don't know something, please teach me. So I wanted to flip that dynamic. So I decided to start asking people who knew more than me to teach me how to do things. And then I could share those videos with the people who were asking the questions so that I was the person who didn't know. And I was the person asking the beginner questions and making mistakes. So I wasn't asking people to kind of screw up in public, right? I'm the one who screws up in public. And once I switched that dynamic, I felt like we're onto something here. Like, this is working. So from there, originally it was just, I had a Zoom call and I streamed my desktop to Twitch. As it gained momentum, I think the first thing I did was stuck a little logo down in the corner. And then after that went a little bit further, I was like, okay, maybe this needs more branding. So I learned about overlays and OBS and all the wiring and stuff. And then that's what grew into Learn with Jason over time. So I think now I think we crossed 300 episodes last month. So we're we're now
Damn.
trucking on toward 400.
Jeez, that's insane. I remember when I first added the calendar to, or like the Learning with Jason, like schedule calendar to my calendar, and saw how often you were doing it. It was like, oh, damn, you're really all in on this. Mad respect for it.
I mean, at this, especially now with my job being in leadership, it's the only time I get to write code or really dive into code. So I'm very protective of that time. And the twice a week schedule is just to, how else do I keep up with what's going on out there? I don't have time to do independent research or try stuff on my own. So I gotta create that space, and having an expert to guide me helps me get a better read on what's going on. And, it's got the bonus of being like, hopefully other people who just want the really high level, like, how do I even think about this tool? I don't want to necessarily go do the research project or build a proof of concept. I just want to know if I should care. It tends to provide a little bit of that.
Yeah. Something you touched on that I really love about this is the idea of like, you didn't make this content with a greater external purpose of, I am going to make the world better by making this content. You had a much more specific, like, I have this problem. I want to learn about these technologies. I am going to solve this problem I have with content. And that's when I think channels tend to do the best. And you've described yourself, it's like things took off at that point when you had the thing that you cared about, the problem you were solving right there in front of you. All of a sudden things started moving way faster.
Exactly. Right. I think that's the part about content creation that has been maybe the most challenging to internalize, but it's the one that gets said the most often, is that the best content is the content that you write for yourself yesterday.
Yes.
Right? If you are capturing the things that you learned today for the person who didn't know yesterday, which was you, then you're creating something super valuable because it's fresh in your mind. You've still got that beginner's mind. You're not trying to, like, when I try to write beginner JavaScript content, I've been writing JavaScript for like 20 years now. I don't make sense to somebody who's on day one. But if I just learned something about Astro, last week. So if I write about that, it's fresh in my mind. I understand what I'm talking about, and I can like get that conceptual jump from like 0 to 1. And it's a total game changer for content creators like that, and just remembering to show up.
Yep. That's the other really big one. Caring enough to push yourself through the hard parts, and also to make something that you're passionate about, like having that passion throughout your content shows. People see that, they feel it, they understand that. And if you can consistently provide that, you're going to succeed. You're going to have a way better response to the work you're doing, and a much better result coming out consistently. Like, the genesis of my channel wasn't, I wanted to be a YouTuber. I had like 2 specific goals. The first was better understand the space for what we were building at Ping. I really wanted to deeply understand the creator problems we were solving, and felt like as a viewer, I got a decent bit. And as a friend of a lot of creators, I heard a lot of things, but I wanted to understand it. So started making content for that. The other reason was I just left my job at Twitch. I no longer was surrounded by super talented engineers that I respected the hell out of. The people who like taught me everything I know. The Slack room with 300 passionate front-end engineers that we could just like go back and forth on like the new Svelte release and stuff like that. Even though we were a big like, React company, it was fun talking with these people about these things. And a conversation I had with Jack Harrington recently is the idea of like the lunch conversation that we kind of lost during COVID, where like as a recently hired like intern or junior engineer at a company like Twitch or Amazon, I could go to lunch and have 2 principal engineers that have been leading the platform for years talking about stuff that I don't understand at all, but I can get some amount from. I can like sit there and take in a bunch of info, maybe ask some stupid questions, but the amount that those conversations help you ground yourself, give yourself a path, and like grow, and the amount of value that those more like senior conversations, even if you're not at that level yourself, bring, is incredible. And I lost that when I left Twitch, and we lost that when COVID happened. I think a lot of why I made the channel was trying to bring that back.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really challenging about remote work, which like I love remote work. I've been remote for years and years and years, and I don't think I would ever go back to a co-located company. But when I was at IBM, I would work in the office 3 days a week. And the only reason that I went into the office was because at lunchtime, I would go grab people from different teams around the company, and I would be like, we're going to lunch. Come on. And we would go walk to lunch. We would sit down, and I would just hear what the folks on the IBM design components team were working on, or hear what the DevOps team was struggling with, or any of those things. And as a result, you just get to connect these dots. Like, you've got brilliant people having conversations about what they're working on. You've also got these sort of insights into the problems that different types or different archetypes of developers are facing, or different teams. Like, oh, we built these really cool components and nobody will use them. Or you got the DevOps team saying, like, we keep building these great structures and nobody will actually, like, they keep copy pasting the old Docker image instead of using this new thing we built. And so all the work that I do in developer experience was hugely informed by conversations like that, where you listen to somebody who doesn't work in your field, or who's at a different level or different team, talking about, like, what are they excited about? What are they struggling with? What are the things that they really love? And what are the things they really hate? And all of that is so priceless. And when you move to a fully remote environment, it feels super cheesy to set up like a donut call. Like, if you've ever used the donut app on Slack, where you have to basically like put your hat in a ring, you get randomly assigned to somebody for a 30-minute conversation. It's like, oh, this is the worst, right? Or like, you set up these happy hour calls and you've got 40 people on different time zones with all the time lag that happens because of that, trying to have a free form conversation. It's just chaos, right? I think this is why people love in-person events. You know, like the hallway track at conferences is, for most people who regularly attend conferences, like, the talks are wonderful, but the real value of going to a conference is that hallway track. And that's the thing that really, you know, every new idea that changed my career, every introduction or somebody saying like, oh, you know, there's an opportunity over here. Each one of those it came out of a casual conversation. Nobody set a formal meeting with me to be like, I have a thing that I think would help you. It's always like, somebody says something like, wait, I'm interested in that. Tell me more. And then, oh, it turns out I could build a system that solves that problem. And that actually solves one of my problems. And, you know, then you're off to the races. That's how I ended up re-architecting a lot of the front end for IBM Cloud. And that's how a lot of the stuff that went well at Gatsby happened, was, you know, casual conversations with people who were stoked about Gatsby, figured out what they were interested in, what was motivating, and then built programs that, you know, dug into that. I never want to advocate going back in person, but I really, really like finding ways to get groups of people who are excited about the same thing together so that they can discuss.
I couldn't agree more about the hallway track aspect of things, both in conferences, but also just like at the office, the conversations you overhear walking around, the moments that like most of the teams I was on at Twitch were people who I saw, like, overheard in a conversation, like at lunch or in the hall, and met through those ways. As great as Slack and meetings can be, those impromptu moments are where a lot of magic happens. It's similar to like the biggest value in college is like the people that you meet in the like community around. Trying to capture that remote is really difficult, but I do genuinely think we're getting pretty close to that with what we've built in my community. Like, we have frameworks being formed in like the sub-only channels in my Discord, and that's just incredible to watch.
The Discords are really something else. I think that saved me. Like, I have one that I'm in called Party Corgi, where I just like, I don't actually engage a lot in the text chat, but I play Fortnite because it's the way that I keep my brain from thinking about things that I'm not on the clock to be thinking about. And all the side chats in there are so good because it brings back that casualness. You know, we're playing Fortnite, but there's a ton of downtime in that game. So you just kind of chat and have these arbitrary conversations that lead to some really interesting insights, and people have, you know, spun off side projects and utility packages and really interesting stuff that comes out of just, you know, shooting the shit, really.
Yeah. I think that we get a lot of that out of Twitter Spaces, but it's like the exact same thing where there's a certain level of like casual passing by conversation that doesn't happen when you're in a work meeting, that we're able to get by having a casual Twitter space at the end of the workday where we're just complaining about life and code and whatever else. And some of those conversations have ended up being like massive drivers for real change at places like Vercel, on frameworks like Solid.js, and all these like cool things we talk about. Sometimes the people who make them and work for them show up as well. And that's how like this stream started originally as me having a space on Twitter every Wednesday. I started co-streaming it and then just leaned into the stream because it made a lot of sense what we were building at Ping.
Yeah, and I mean, I do love, one of the things that I really love is how engaged like the folks building this stuff are. You know, if you say state machines 3 times, David Courtsheet's going to be in your chat, right? You say You talk about rendering or like DOM elements, and like Ryan Carniato will arrive. And it's great because they're paying attention, they're listening to what people are struggling with, and I think it's leading to, I don't know, there's this interesting cycle that I've been seeing with web dev, and maybe this is the way that we segue into talking about JAMStack. But there's this interesting like cycle that I've seen in web dev, because I've been building for the web since like the early 2000s, and at first everybody was writing like DHTML, right? That was the thing that you had to write, and it was terrible, and it was super complex, and you had all these browser specific workarounds, and then John Rasig drops Sizzle and jQuery, and you're like, wait, this is simple. I can do this. So you see this explosion in innovation where people are building out these really incredible experiences, and all the complexity of building cross-browser went away thanks to jQuery. Then, because everybody was using jQuery, they wanted to build more stuff. So they built jQuery tools on top of jQuery tools on top of jQuery tools. And then they built that into like Rails monoliths. And so there were these interesting stacks that were like, let's build a full stack solution out of, this thing. But it had all these other assumptions built into the original simplicity, and it just got too cumbersome. It was too much. So then Angular and Backbone and eventually React emerged.
And that's when I come in. I managed to dodge most of these bullets ahead. I did some PHP back in the day, but mostly was living in like Java and Python server land. So I avoided all of this chaos until React and specifically TypeScript happened.
Yeah. So then we get like React comes in and kind of wins the first wave of the framework wars, where we had Angular and all the other ones that like Dojo and Backbone and all these other ones that everybody was using, kind of simplified, where all of those are still out there. There's a huge number of people still building production systems using all of those frameworks. jQuery, I think, is still the most popular JavaScript framework. But
did Steam
people
still
started
Backbone?
Centralizing on React, right? Like the modern stuff was all built on React. So then people started like, well, what else can we do with React? Well, let's make React into a server language. Let's make React into like, let's build meta frameworks on top of it. Let's build utility packages that sit on top of our meta framework so that we can do this other thing. Now they're talking about concurrency and server components and all these things. And I'm feeling a sea change. Like the articles are no longer like, this is how React is going to save your life. It's now like, well, here's how to succeed in spite of React, which is what it felt like when jQuery was reaching its tipping point, where it lost the zeitgeist. And so what I'm interested in is we're starting to see the same, like the spirit that led to React is starting to lead toward what I think will succeed React. We've got, Rich Harris and Svelte. We've got Ryan Carniato and Solid. We've got Fred Schott and the Astro team. We've got the Vite team is doing incredible work, where it's sort of making the React part matters less. Now it's more of like, how do you build for the web with less? There was a pretty clear signal from Jason Miller that like Preact is no longer a React clone. It's now going to become its own thing. That's really clear signal. Get it?
Good pun.
But I think we're driving towards simplicity again, where we see the complexity that happens on the web, and we go, well, we can build on this so far. This is too much. It's too hard to get simple things done. I want something simple. So then we all reset to something simple. A winner will emerge. We'll build all of our complexity on top of it, and then we'll all have the same conversation in 5 to 7 to 10 years about whatever the successor is, and get frustrated, and then we'll innovate somewhere else, right? And so what I'm excited about is that this one feels like it's being built collaboratively as an ecosystem. I'm watching the Quick team talk to the Solid team, talk to the Astro team about what the best way forward is. I'm watching, Eleventy is pulling inspiration out of Marco, and they're all sharing ideas and celebrating each other's wins and collaborating in a way that makes me feel like whatever succeeds React isn't coming out of a war. It's coming out of more of a renaissance. And I think that is really fascinating.
I see a bit of a pendulum swing at the same time, where it feels like we're always going back and forth from like the server sends HTML to the client owns everything. Oh my God, look at all the things we can do in client land. That back and forth is something that's much more prominent now in like post React world, where the recommended way of using React for the longest time was do everything on the client. We've since realized that was wrong and swung back as far the other way as we can with stuff like Astra, where Astra will only give you HTML if you want JavaScript, you bring that yourself. Like I'm
Mm-hmm.
seeing this trend towards things that understand that at the like end, we are making a document and sending it to the user, and making that as simple as possible without compromising the wins we get from these other tools. Like the harsh reality is I enjoy building websites in React more than I do with HTML, even if it is a static site. Like the component
Right.
models and the reusability that those architectures enable is so powerful. And I think that's a big part of what inspired what became the JAMStack.
Yeah, I mean, so the general idea is if you look at what the origin of the JAMStack was, we had a bunch of companies that were this is where I wish I was as good at like live diagramming as you are, but we had a bunch of companies that were building monoliths, right? So you've got all of your code in one big chunk, and it's a mess. I inherited one of these at IBM where it's it's a million lines of code, no joke, and it's write only, because nobody quite understands how the code base works. So you never delete anything. You only add stuff to the bottom of the file. So you're opening up a utility file that's 15,000 lines long, and it's just really, really difficult to reason about, to maintain, to iterate on this code. So then this idea of microservices comes along. And microservices from a backend standpoint are brilliant because you're separating things by concern. So instead of having this big pile of code, you've got these vertical separations of code. But the problem is that people are still treating the front end as like an output function of what the microservice does. And so now instead of having like the monolith, which had one front end, you've got 35 microservices and 35 independent front end code bases. And that sucks. So then people started saying like, well, no, we need to go back to the monolith, back to the monolith. And so the JAMStack was this idea that you can actually have your cake and eat it too here by decoupling the front end entirely from the back end services. So you only speak to your microservices or your monolith or third-party APIs or whatever it is through well-defined API contracts. And that allows you to have your microservice like back-end code bases. And then you've got this horizontally fully integrated front end that acts. So basically you're turning the front end into a microservice, right? It's no longer a product of other microservices or a product of the monolith. It is its own independently owned code base that speaks to other code bases via well-defined API contracts. And the benefit of this is because the front end is only communicating through these API contracts, you get these other downstream benefits, like you can fully pre-compile it in a lot of data sets and just ship static HTML to the browser, which means you don't have to deal with, like, you never have to configure a varnish cache. You don't have to ask your front-end engineers to understand how Nginx works. All of these really interesting things start to fall out because you can just rely on CloudFront, or when services like Netlify and Vercel, or they have their own CDNs pre-configured so that you don't ever have to think about caching headers, right? And so then as this evolves, you've got serverless functions and things that come in and sort of invalidate the need for like fully statically compiled things. But the separation is still true. You still have this like fully integrated front end layer, and then you have the API contract, but now it's to a serverless function, which is simple enough that a front end dev can write it, right? I think what was interesting for me with the JAMStack is that because of the migration towards serverless and like database as a service, as opposed to fully hosted configuring a Postgres database or whatever, now I can just say, well, I want to use this. It's all an API. So I'm now a full stack dev because I'm using these like platform as a service things. So I clearly don't understand how to be a DB admin. I clearly don't understand how to like configure, scale Kubernetes, or deal with a DDoS attack, but I've got a bunch of services that do that for me. And they gave me a clear API contract. So I can set up and build my own database, set up and build my own backend, all these sorts of things that now allow me as a dev to have an idea and get it on the internet without having to like have 6 disciplines worth of engineering knowledge. And so, you know, that separation of front end from all other logic via API contract was the original, like that was the original benefit. That was the simplification, because by doing that, you can deploy it independently. Your web devs can be web devs. They don't have to be full stack devs or ops or anything like that. And they can do it without a lot of risk, because there's not a lot of risk to updating the UI. If you screw it up, great, roll it back. You're not like permanently destroying the database or things that can go wrong with backend microservices. That's the push towards simplicity. And that was the ethos of the JAMStack. I think over time, what's happened is, you know, through marketing choices that were made and things that people ran with that were kind of said in passing or whatever, we've managed to turn it into something that feels like there's a right and a wrong way to JAMStack. But I think JAMStack in my mind is more of an architectural approach. It's like choosing to go with MVC or if you start talking about like dry apps and what counts as dry, when is dry a bad idea, right? Like JAMStack's the same thing. It's an approach to building front ends for the modern web that it has, some of it may be server rendered, and that part you wouldn't call JAMStack, but like the parts that can be separated completely and don't need to be server rendered and all those things, like that's totally fine. That is JAMStack. I feel like I got a little off on a tangent there.
It was a very different definition than I am used to for JAMStack. It's actually very interesting to me. If I'm understanding correctly, you're almost seeing it as like federated GraphQL style, like the layer that communicates with all of the other backend services, but that layer lives fully in the front end's code base.
Yeah, I mean, in the sense that like I've always seen, so going back to my IBM experience, what I would see is the backend microservice would be making a bunch of like data lake queries. So like our accounting board or dashboard would be going back and getting all of your transactions and all of these things. And then that would get thrown into like some node middleware where you would do a bunch of business logic and parsing. And then that would be run through Express, which would be pulling in templates and like taking the stuff that just ran through business logic and smashing it into a template. And then what you get out the other side is HTML. Mm-hmm. And so the JAMStack is the idea that instead of having your business logic slam into a template, you have your business logic expose a JSON blob. Like this is the data. And then that can change as long as the output, like the API contract doesn't change. How the backend can just build, you can switch it from Rust to Go or from Ruby to whatever you want, right? And the front end, the other services that consume it never need to care. And so by moving the front end to this model where what it does is make API calls and display data, I think this is why like GraphQL is exciting to some folks, especially who are in the JAMStack space, because you can kind of get just the data you need. And now you've got this tiny little object that you like, that's the data I needed. I've put it on the screen. There is no business logic. It's not federation in the sense that you're like the broker of all of this data transaction. It's federated in the sense that yes, that is the code base making the API calls, but there's no business logic there. Like business logic would live in the microservice, or if you need to do business logic as a front end dev, you'd probably put it in a proxy, like a serverless function, or if you need a longer running service, you'd stand up your own proxy microservice that does the data munging. Because again, like the front end in this model is presentational. It's not core to business logic.
Very interesting. I hadn't had JAMStack framed this way before. I do like it as almost as like JAMStack is you have a stack of JavaScript that's separate from your backend.
Yeah. I think that's the way that I think about it, at least, because I'm trying to think of, if I take this front end and I hand it to somebody else, who do I have to tell, right? And if all of your stuff is communicated through an API layer, your backend teams never need to know that you've migrated from Angular to React, or that you're switching from React to Astro and Islands architecture. It doesn't give a shit. Like nothing changes for them functionally, right? The only time you need to talk is if your front end needs data that's not being delivered and you have to update that API contract, or if they're like taking something down and like, hey, this API endpoint's not going to work anymore. So it hugely simplifies communication between teams. And like, that's the ultimate goal, right? We're looking for autonomy as developers. I, as the front end dev, want to be able to push a commit to my front end code base and have it automatically go live. And when you're working on a big team that's got, 30, 40 microservices, if your microservices are also what's generating the front end, you can't do that. You have to go to a staging environment. You have to go through QA. You have to have DevOps roll it out on Thursdays whenever, new production goes live, because there's too much risk involved if you're messing with the microservice code base. And even if you've done a good job in your microservice of like separating out the front end from the back end code and it's all in different files and that stuff, there's still risk that somebody doesn't know about that and will like reach into a backend util and pull it into the front and make a big mess of your code, right? Because it's all in the same pile. So this is more of like an enforced separation of concerns. And like, don't get me wrong, you can still make terrible choices. Like, you can make a huge mess by like building yourself a micro backend as a bunch of serverless functions on top of existing microservices. Like, you know, it's not a silver bullet, but it does allow for a clean enough separation of concerns that as teams are speaking to each other, they have a very limited space that they have to have full overlap on.
This is a very interesting way of framing it. It's like, it's not, JAMStack isn't a way of building, it's like a set of fences almost.
Yes, exactly. It's an architectural approach. I mean, I would call it a philosophy, but then that makes me sound like an asshole. But it really kind of is like it's a way of thinking about writing apps.
That makes a ton of sense. Have to do one quick call out as the creator who is live. I'm taking a look at numbers quickly. I noticed that there's 260 of you watching live on YouTube and only 78 likes. 78 likes. Really, guys? Come on. Hit that button. It's free. Likes are free. They cost you nothing. Sorry.
This is, it's funny because I saw this, Steven Johnson is saying, bump it up or we're going to get yelled at. And I thought that was a joke. I didn't realize that.
No, they'll get yelled at. They know how this works. It's a trade. They get free content. I get free likes.
And look at it go. Wow.
Yeah,
everybody hit that
almost
button.
instantaneously.
That is amazing.
Yeah. Call to actions work.
Amazing.
It's crazy how that works. But yeah, people like hitting buttons when you tell them that they're there. And if you haven't hit the sub button that's right next to that like button for some reason, please, it's right there and also free. So
remember, ring that bell.
I am a little surprised by this definition specifically because it makes me realize I haven't been a JAMStack developer for like years. I very, very tightly couple my backend to my front end. I actually remember somebody tweeted, it was meant to be an insult towards TRPC, where and I didn't realize that when they tweeted it because I love the tweet. It was TRPC is tightly coupled backend for your front end. And I liked and retweeted it immediately because I love that. Like, I am building a front end. I'm building this for my users. My goal is to build the simplest possible like user experience with the shortest pipe between that and my infrastructure, my databases. How can I break down those barriers and make development as simple as possible for my team?
So this is interesting because your philosophy, like you're asking the same questions and coming to an absolute opposite standpoint of what I would come to. And I wonder if this is a scale thing. One of the things that I find really interesting is I think I said the what got us here won't get us there.
Yes.
And this isn't like I'm not saying this as I know, like this isn't me trying to be like, listen, you young whippersnapper. But it's more of just a question of my own lived experience as an engineer. Because I love tightly coupled stuff when I'm building it myself, right? Because everything's in one file. I know exactly where to go. I know what I'm looking for. And as soon as I have to hand it off to another dev, I want it all decoupled. I think the reasoning for that is that what I want to be able to do is select which context somebody needs to understand to make them productive, right? And so when I was at IBM, for example, you know, I'm front-end architect working on 30 something teams at IBM Cloud. And one of the big problems that we had is the way that they did microservices at IBM was not maybe ideal. It was like they had the monolith and then they just duplicated the monolith 35 times. And they were like, great, now you've got microservices and you can just, you can edit whatever you need for your service, knowing that it won't break the other services. But what that led to was when a new front end dev, specifically, I have been hired as a front end developer, got hired at IBM, their first 1 to 2 weeks was spent configuring a proxy, configuring a bunch of like Nginx commands, setting up a whole bunch of like deep Docker images and all this stuff that was way out of their understanding and really their need to understand. They were working in a context that was completely foreign to them. And so it was a huge productivity drain. And like any time that something got written poorly, like a super senior dev would do something in the full stackiness that like pulled a utility from somewhere way down in the back end up into the front end for this one quick thing because they didn't want to write whatever piece of front end was necessary for it. And that would lead to the front end devs now accidentally breaking deep node code that they literally had never heard of or understood. They've never worked with. And so when we did a, not quite JAMStack, because it didn't really, like, IBM wasn't set up to do that, but as close as I could get, where I separated the front end out from the back end microservice in a way that was independently deployable. And what we found was the front end teams immediately, like, they were making commits on day one because they didn't need to care about what the back end context was or how that Nginx stuff was set up. It didn't matter. That was all pre-configured in this little, I made a tiny little module that kind of set up the front end for them. And so as the, working on a huge team, there's no way somebody's going to understand the full context. Like, that's why we got to microservices in the first place. And I think that's why this JAMStack approach took off in the way it did when it came out in 2015, is that it was a way to say, hey, developer, you work, like, you are paid to do this work. This is the thing you've been hired to own. And this is literally the only part of this you need to understand. So your ramp up time goes way down. Your context required, the level of expertise required. So now you don't need to go out and find those, like, multi 6-figure unicorn devs who are like, double principal or whatever level you have to hire to get somebody who can do systems work from the Kubernetes up to the CSS, right? You could just hire somebody who was a great JavaScript, HTML, and CSS dev, and they didn't have to care about anything else in the stack. And so I think that's why I think, at least for me, the scale played a huge factor in why I started thinking about things from that JAMStack and decoupled approach. However, I did have Alex on Learn with Jason, and we looked at TRPC. It's freaking cool. Like, I love that, the end-to-end type safety, and it's a beautifully implemented system that I would totally use if I was building something for myself. I just haven't seen how something like that scales when you get to 30, 40, 150 developers and beyond. When, can somebody reasonably understand the full code base?
Yeah, I think this is two different approaches to the same problem, where your approach is complexity at scale is inevitable. How can we separate concerns to handle that complexity as, like, early
Right.
and, like, low friction as possible? My other side, like, having worked at Twitch and other, like, companies, like, no IBMs in my history, but a handful of Twitches and things that aspire to be that size. My disagreement is, I think, reducing the dimensions of problems and going out of your way to reduce complexity for as long as you can allows you to not need that separation for a lot longer and move exponentially faster as a result. Every code base ever made 100%. Starts as a 10-person or less team when it starts, and eventually becomes a bigger code base. But even at big companies like IBM, I would argue that there's a lot of, like, smaller products, smaller teams, smaller things, where starting with something like Create T3 app will let you deliver the value to your users faster. And if it turns out that code base and that use case does need to scale, you can scale it then. And I would also argue that something like TRPC, and the way it's architected, especially when you use something like Create T3 app, is you're just writing TypeScript functions, and then on the client, you're calling them with React Query, replacing that server with anything else. Like, throw it on Fastify and switch it over to REST. Go scale it however you want, wherever else. But to start, we can move so much faster.
Wait, but hold on. Let me just ask. So the way that the T3 stack is working then is you're writing API endpoints that you then consume with React Query?
Yes.
That's JAMStack, dog.
But it's all in the same package JSON, where I'm importing the backend code directly in my front end. I type trpc.user.getinfo.useQuery. But in the end, it compiles into JAMStack.
But if you were to drop that API out into a separate package, you could still consume it the same way, right? You wouldn't need to make changes in your front end other than just now it's an import from, at T3.
I would have to find another way to deploy it, but because it all deploys in the same package JSON. But theoretically, yes, if you did break it up that way.
But that's kind of what I mean, is like it's like you've still created the separation of concerns. Like, you've got a clear API contract between your backend and your front end. And as long as nobody's going around TRPC to, like, access your data directly, and this is where big code bases get tricky, because at a certain scale, you can't rely on people to make good choices anymore. And that's really where I've found the breakdown happens without explicitly enforced separation, is that if you're relying on a human person to make a good choice under pressure, it's gonna let you down at least one time out of 10. And that part makes it really challenging to, like, you can write a bunch of linting rules, you can do all these other things, but now you're moving the overhead of like what it would have taken to manage a separated code base to policing the integrated code base, because now you've got code cops and like that. So I mean, I guess the thing is like the human complexity doesn't go away. There's no code we can write that will make humans make good choices. So instead, the way that I've heard this put, I say make the right thing the easy thing. I've heard people say, make the right things easy and the hard things and the bad things hard, right? Like that sort of approach is there are a million ways to slice that. And, depending on how you're going to make choices about code organization or how you're going to make choices about hiring or team structure, like if you build a full stack team, code review will catch those sorts of things. If you're building like a front end team and a back end team, the front end team might not catch in code review that they've done something that won't scale because they touch something in the middle tier or the back end tier that is actually going to be a nightmare later on. And so there are so many different reasons that one architecture would work over another, or why you would make different choices about, how to organize code or separate concerns. But I think at a certain point, Dunbar's number is 150, right? At the point after which you cannot possibly know all of your coworkers. Once you get past that point, humans stop thinking about each other as like people they need to take care of, and they just start thinking about whether or not they're going to get their paycheck. And I got to deliver this by Friday, and that's somebody else's problem if I made a bad choice in my code. Yeah, I think that's maybe the question under the question of like, why write code in certain ways at all? Like, why does architecture matter? It's because eventually you're going to have to, create artificial barriers to drive human decision making. And it's just, making the choice which one is the right barrier to put up.
Yep. And my tech philosophy around like, I will be honest, I transitioned from like 2,000 plus person Twitch land to 20 or less person startup land pretty hard, pretty fast. And what I'm seeing more than anything is a lot of companies and a lot of developers and a lot of like early stage startups building like their Facebook, hiring up a dev tools team, spinning up Kubernetes they have more servers than they have users. I've talked to 7 separate startups that have more servers than they have users. It is hilarious how common a trend that is. It eats away at me to know that. And I feel like most code bases have engineers who run them that care a lot about all of like the issues you're describing. Like more often than not, the person in charge of the code base does think about these things and does care about these things. My concern is, given too much opportunity, they will reinvent Facebook before there's a user for that code. And most of my development philosophy is focused on both how do we get to the first user as fast as possible, and on the other side, how do we take as little risk, tech debt, and anchoring in our design when we do that? Like, this is why I'm not really into technologies like Firebase or using like Superbase's JS client. I don't like the idea of these solutions being bought into a specific way of interfacing with your data, such that if I want to change that in the future, I can't. Like at Ping, you might not, when you were actually one of the first users, we switched off of Postgres on AWS over to PlanetScale MySQL while people were live in calls because I accidentally hit deploy. And it was a seamless transition because we had Prisma as the layer in between there. So when I did the deploy, Prisma didn't give a shit. It was just hitting a different database and everything worked as it was supposed to. And that's the memes, the ship of Theosius, where every piece in Theo's ships can and has been replaced multiple times at this point. And when you build in that way, and we get to the point where there's 150 people, or I hire a Jason and you're pissed at me because of how complex I've made everything with it all being in one code base and everybody chaotically importing everything everywhere. You have a much clearer point of separation there with TRPC is the only place where data is being fetched. Prisma is the only way we're touching the database. The server-side functions through something like get server-side props not being used at all because they're an anti-pattern. And these separations making it a lot easier to split up the parts when you need to. And more importantly, they help you get to the point where you need to more regularly because the code base doesn't collapse and your users don't get like when a user has a problem, we can fix it faster due to the way we built.
Yeah, no, I think we're in violent agreement here because I'm very much in the same boat. And like when we're talking about like minimizing the time to value, I don't actually care how many servers run. I care how many code bases I have to mess with, right? And so one of the things that I think about a lot is if I was starting a company right now, I mean, I work at Netlify, so I'd use Netlify, but any of these platforms that have like serverless functions, edge functions, and front end code all deployed out of the same code base through like a single config file, I would use backend as a service, platform as a service, database as a service for all of the things that I don't want to manage and configure myself. I would also probably reach for Planet Scale because it works in edge functions. I would then use edge functions for a lot of logic close to the user for data access patterns, things like that. I would build the site, like the front end would be using, whatever, Astro, Next, Solid,
Remix,
whatever. I need it all. Whatever the new hot, Remix, the new hotness, something. Get it deployed out in a way that is close to the users. So on a CDN, have the serverless functions deployed alongside for any of the backend API stuff, have the edge functions for any of that, like near to the customer data access and personalization. And all that runs out of one repo. So the fact that under the hood, that's a bunch of servers and a bunch of config and proxy setup, I don't care, right? And later, if I need to switch to where my Planet Scale stuff is running out of a database, like I would do the same thing as you, where Prisma is running as the data access layer in serverless functions, or if I was using Next or Remix in my actions or my, get static props, because that is still a separation of concerns. And to me, that's still JAMStack, because what you're doing is the code base all runs out of the same repo, but you can't misuse a serverless function. Like you can't reach into the guts of a serverless function and call it, because it's not like the boundary is clear. And so that, like, for me, philosophically, that's the main goal, is that even if somebody goes in trying to do evil, they can't. Like they could copy paste the code out and put it into the front end, but it doesn't matter, because now that code can get out of sync, it can break, and it won't break the back end. And we can yell at them later in code review if it's necessary. But I think that's sort of the intention. Violent agreement.
That's one of my favorite musician friends, John Wayne. He's a producer and rapper, so that's going to be a song or a band with that name by the end of the month at this rate.
Love it.
I really like the point of, like, if you're thinking about infra, you're not really thinking about the problem at hand. And I totally agree in that sense. When I say that a company had more servers than users, I also mean they were thinking more about those servers than their users, which is the problem. I have more so.
See, that part bums me out. One of the things that always makes me really sad is when somebody's got a really, really good proof of concept and they've clearly solved an immediate problem, and then some tech wonk in the background smashes it because they're like, this isn't going to scale. It's like,
yep.
Okay, well then you fix it in 3 days and actually solve a problem, because right now this is an actual problem that actually needs to be solved today, and you're stopping this based on hypothetical problems that will hypothetically occur if we somehow otherwise solve this problem and continue to grow. Like let's solve problems today, a month from now, 6 months from now, but like if we continue to grow at the rate that we're growing, cool. We will address that problem when it's getting closer. But man, it drives me nuts when people are like, yeah, we're gonna make sure that we can scale to 1 billion. Like you said, we're gonna be able to scale to 1 billion concurrent users, but we currently have 3.
Yep. I would love to run into theoretical scaling problems. Like, we built fully serverless, so it's, God, if we hit scale problems, that means we're doing very well as a business, and I'm excited. There's a video I haven't put out yet. I did it a few streams ago. Are you familiar with the streamer, the Primagen, the like back-end focused Fullstack dev from Netflix? He's all about building like scalable Rust solutions and doing everything like the most performant way. He's on a war against Node.js to an extent. And I have a diagram I drew. I saw them off the setup, so I can't easily show it. But I have a diagram, and I have on it what I call the Primagen line, which is the line at which your costs are at a point where not hiring a Primagen is irresponsible. And I feel like most people in most code bases like to think that line gets hit a lot earlier than it does, especially because like we're all thinking from the dev's perspective more often than not. And to us, oh, it's only a few more hours to set up the configuration that way. And something I want to do because I like Kubernetes and I want to feel good about the depth of the technical problems I'm solving every day. And I find that mindset is a lot different for me on the other side now as boss, where it's like, yes, you could go spend a few hours doing that, but now I need somebody at your level or higher to maintain it. And a
Right.
few hours of yours are literally thousands of dollars at the rate that like these like very high level engineers are being paid. Like, to you, this is a quick thing. To me as the lead, that is a big expensive thing. How can
Well,
we make everything as simple and short a pipe as possible?
And I think you touched on something else, that, well, maybe you didn't, reminded me of something else, which is that for a lot of engineers, when we think about it from the dev perspective, this is also the thing that we do for fun. Like, so many engineers would say, the thing that I do for work is the thing that I would do for a hobby if it wasn't my job. Right. And I know that's not true for everybody. That's not a blanket statement, but I think the folks who over architect systems almost unanimously would fall into that set of like, I love doing programming. And so there needs to be editing when you're building systems as an engineer, to look at a system and go, how much of this am I doing because it's important? And how much of this am I doing because it's fun? And many of us, myself included, do not have that ability to edit down. And so we solve the problem and then we create 5 more because it's fun to solve problems. And then, when we finally realize that we've tied ourselves a Gordian knot with our code, we have to then, like, at least the pattern I've seen is that 18 to 24 months after you get hired, you made yourself a big mess, and then you bounce to the new company and say it's going to be different this time. And then somebody inherits your stuff. And if it's another dev who likes to over architect systems, they will propose a full rebuild, and they'll burn everything down, and they'll over architect it again. And then, it's why you got the 3 to 5 year greenfield cycle of companies being like, it's too complicated. And then some hotshot architect comes in and goes, I'm going to solve it all. We'll re-architect it in Remix, and it's going to solve all of our problems. But then they build all this crap on top of Remix that nobody else understands after they leave. And it's exactly the same problem that you had before, where somebody had over-architected it on top of Backbone and nobody understood how that worked either, right? So it's a lot of it is recognizing that as developers, we are absolutely our own worst enemies when it comes to this stuff, because we're not asking the question, like, is this important? We're asking, am I having fun? Is this the thing that I want to solve? Most of the time, you don't need to do that. Like, do that as a hobby project on the side. It'll be super fun.
Have you seen Ken's blog architecture?
Oh yeah, exactly.
Like
right. It's super fun. It's super fun to over architect the holy Christ out of everything. I do it all the time, but I try not to ship it.
What's funny is I don't know why I never had that in me, but I was never really into the over architecture. And I think a lot of people stereotype me as someone who is, because I'm like on the bleeding edge with all this fancy new tech and shit. I don't adopt things that don't make my life easier, period. Like, I might go play with it for a little bit, but I just get annoyed really easily. Even something that seemed like a surefire hit for me, like Tori, it was way too hard to read files in Tori without knowing how to write Rust and being like into Rust a decent bit. So I gave up and went back to Electron. And like, I am very quick and excited even to drop things that don't make me move faster and don't make it easier for me and my teams to solve the problems our users have. And I
have a question for you. Like, there's this classic conundrum of build versus buy, right? Where is the keep it because we know it versus drop it because it makes us slow, right? Because there's always a ramp up time when you pick up a new tool. You've got to do all the cultural retraining of like, hey, we just changed all of our tools. Everybody learned the new system. How are you, like, what's your heuristic for that? When do you decide this is going to make us more in the long run if we deal with the pain of switch, versus we should stick with this because we're fast enough and the switching cost is too high?
When the benefit of switching is a clear exponential win against that cost, or the team is demoralized from the current cost we're paying every day. I think the latter tends to be the case more often, where we just get annoyed by a thing and we see this other thing on the other side of the fence and we just want it, because once we know it exists, someone's going to go at it over the weekend. Like, my team's all the types of people who hang out in the Twitch chat here. We're all hanging out. There's over almost 800 of us watching live right now, just talking about software and like architecture stuff for fun on a Wednesday afternoon. We aren't here as a group representative of the average developer. So I have the problem that most people who run teams like mine have, of the devs want to go build crazy shit all the time and play with all these things like we were talking about before. So if I can steer that in the direction of things that make us move faster and paying off the cost of things that we're annoyed by, that tends to work pretty well for us. That said, I do not want to host a WebSocket server. So we still buy things like that and deal with the cost of it.
Right.
And I have went on many a long rant about the state of WebSocket as a service. And we also have the unique advantage of, like, I have this show. If there's a service I'm having problems with, I can tweet at them or bring the CEO on the show, hype them up on one of the problems I need solved, and then all of a sudden PlanetScale releases their Edge HTTP thing. Like, I've been bullying Sam about that for a year now, and they finally did it, and it's really good, and it's going to change how I architect apps in the future. But I love taking advantage of the wonderful position I am in, and that lets me take more risks and adopt things I might not adopt otherwise. And on top of all of that, like, my core philosophy on how I like architect teams, architecture code bases is building safety nets. I came from a world like a post Amazon acquisition world where everybody was hitting aiming for a 95% code coverage on a front end code base, which is just stupid. And we had all these guardrails that pointed us to nothing, like just rails blocking you every step of the way. And you have to get used to kicking over guardrails constantly, and that's not going to keep you meaningfully safer. Versus safety nets for when things do go wrong, how can you get back on your feet as fast as possible?
Yeah, right. And this is the I think the piece that got me excited when I was re-architecting it at IBM about this idea of the separation of concerns is, you know, when you've built a front end that's fully separate from your back end in terms of like where what code is executing, when something goes wrong, like Netlify and Vercel and all of these, they just have a one-click button. It's like, just put the last version live, right? So you don't get PagerDuty for your front end when you're building this way. When you think in terms of componentized systems and you're thinking about like clear API contracts, if the only time that you need to get paged is if you pushed a huge API change that changes all of the component systems and something goes wrong with it. But otherwise, if like the back end didn't change, the front end has a new thing, and the homepage got all wonky because somebody screwed up the semantics of the HTML and like something's too big now, right? You don't have to roll back a server deploy. You're just deploy the last version of the front end. APIs are all the same, doesn't matter. And I think that like speed to recovery and speed, it also leads to speed to iteration. You know, the Netlify dashboard, for example, is built in Netlify, and because of the way that it's constructed, we ship to production 30, 40, 50 times a day. Like, it's just constant, you know, like little fix, you know, merge that. Oh yeah, like there's a typo, merge it. Nobody's saying batch changes because deployments are risky, or hold this until next week because, you know, we do a deployment every other Wednesday. It's just like, oh, you fix that thing, great, deploy it. Right? We've got a deploy queue, and if something goes wrong, cool, roll that back. We'll fix it later.
Most deploys we've had in a day at Ping is 28, so we got a new number to strive for.
But yeah, like it's the same thing, right? Like the way that you've architected your code makes it safe to experiment and makes it safe to fail, because the risk is super low when you're shipping small things constantly. And I think that, you know, what you mentioned, guardrails. One of the things that is really challenging when you start getting a bigger company is the instinct is process. You want to make it harder for things to go wrong. So you add more linting rules, you add more gates, you add more approvers, you add staging servers and QA servers and you know, blue-green deploys and all these different things. And for certain critical systems, that's really important. Your front end will never be that important. Like, it just doesn't do that much stuff. So unless you have it tied to these critical systems in a way that's inextricable, you can just continually deploy your front end with no, who gives a shit? Just publish it, right? And I think that leads to the teams being, when you put up these guardrails, it leads to teams being resistant to shipping because they don't want to go through the admin hassle of requesting the staging environment and submitting the formal pull request that goes through the checklist of whether or not they did the readiness checks, and going to pair with the QA team while they walk through all the things, and then dealing with the inevitably like huge list of small little things that the QA team will send back, and finding stuff that the QA missed on the last time around. So now things that aren't related to your deployment still need to get fixed before they'll approve this one. It's just stuff like that, right? Where you're relying on too many gates, too many guardrails, and it like completely flips the incentives. Teams don't want to ship when shipping sucks.
Mm-hmm.
So make shipping easy, make shipping fast, make it super low risk. And now you can take your teams and they're stoked because they see their changes live in 10 minutes. And I think that's the magic of these front end architectures, whether it's the, you know, the TRPC and like the Next.js approach, or whether it's a more traditional JAMStack of like a, you know, an Astro site with serverless functions, however you want to roll it. Like what we're trying to do is unlock developer productivity.
That very aligned on that point, and ultimately like agree. All I care about is making my devs as high productivity and low stress as possible. And I think the low stress, first off, something I aim for, and like my team knows at this point I do this, but I try to not tell people too early, and I'm sure people in chat who eventually will work with me, but I try to set things up where my new employees have a significant or cause a significant outage of some form in their first week so they get over it. Because otherwise they're just going to be worried about it for the rest of their career. And the sooner they can get that out of their system, the better.
So everybody, new hires at Ping should just be like, reject all code suggestions from Theo on your pull requests is what I'm understanding.
Probably, actually, yes. Honestly. Generally speaking, too, but at the very least during the first week. Yeah, I don't hire people to learn from me. I hire people to learn from.
No, I do love that. I think it's sort of like when you like dunk somebody in cold water to like immediately get over the shock instead of like trying to ease into it and you're nervous about how cold it is and I don't want to know what it feels like when it gets to my tummy. Like, you know, you're just like, nah, just jump in, like be cold and it'll be over and you'll be super happy to be in the water.
Absolutely. And then you also become more familiar with the system. Exposure therapy, yeah. Then you also become more familiar with how the bounce back works. Like, what does it look like for me to recover from a failure like that? Like, what is that process? Yes. And you find it's not as bad as you may have been worrying about.
Yeah, there was this really interesting social experiment that I saw from a guy. He built rejection therapy, right? Because his whole life he had spent just kind of terrified that people would say no to him. So he wouldn't try things because he didn't want to get rejected. And so he realized that this was very debilitating for him and kept him from doing a bunch of things he would enjoy. So he actually made himself a deck of cards that was like stuff he had to do that people would almost certainly reject him for. Like ask a stranger at a gas station to give you a ride to a town 10 miles over. Nobody's going to do that, right? And so you would ask for these ridiculous things and people would say, I'm sorry, I can't help you. And then you would survive. And in surviving, you build confidence that, oh, okay, that actually didn't hurt. Like I'm not in physical pain. I'm not sad. I'm not crying. Somebody just said no. It's okay to hear no. And then you learn to ask. And then it's easier to go and say something like, I need to have a conversation with my tech lead about a choice that I want to make. And maybe they're not going to be into my idea, but I'm not going to shut down when they say no. I'm going to be able to ask the next question and figure out why, and that'll help me improve. And you know, or if it's such a good thing to learn. Like I will ship this, and if something goes down, it will fix it. Like it's better to learn. Dana Lawson is our SVP of engineering, and she always repeats this phrase. I think it might be something she had at GitHub, which is ship to, right? All of your ideas, all of your hypotheticals, they don't matter. It's like that Mike Tyson thing. Like everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the mouth, right? You can't know whether or not the thing you did is good until you show it to a real user and see if they say that they like it or that they don't. You need the data, you need the measurement. And so building that culture of rapid iteration and then just making sure that every single technical decision you make is built around that. How do we shorten the risk, shorten the time for recovery, shorten the time to deploy so that people are developing, you know, it's a marketing tagline, right? But like developing at the speed of thought. You should be able to have an idea and get that shit live in 15 minutes so that you can then measure whether or not anybody uses it. So you can decide whether or not you should invest real engineering effort into it.
Absolutely agree. I think this is a point that's missed. Like even at Startup Land, like I often have to push the team. It's like, does having this look slightly nicer or code that's slightly cleaner teach us what we're trying to learn here any faster? Like it's our goal to know if this new experience or these new flows are things that users benefit from. How can we get that learning? I want to really like go in on the getting used to rejection things. I think that's not a thing we talk about enough as developers. And there's one place in particular where people are so scared of rejection that I shout about a lot. Interviews. How often do you recommend a developer does an interview?
Like a coding, like a job interview?
Like a job interview for a new potential position.
I guess it would depend on how sweaty your palms get when you think about doing a job interview, right? Because like I've never been particularly, I don't have test anxiety. So when I do a job interview, I don't, it doesn't like feel bad to me. So for me, I don't. Like I'll do a job interview when I need a job. For
Interesting.
folks who the idea of a job interview is absolutely terrifying, like, yeah, practice. Like there's so many good places if you don't want to actually interview, to do mock interviews, to do the take home tests and stuff like that. Or you can do things that are like interviews, like live streaming. You know, the reason that code interviews don't make me nervous is because I live code in front of a bunch of strangers twice a week for 90 minutes, right? Like I get so many reps that it doesn't make me nervous to be on the spot. And I think that, you know, the goal of anything is deliberate practice. If you want to be good at something, you have to do it. And it doesn't need to be exactly that thing. Like you don't necessarily need to go apply for a bunch of jobs to get better at applying for jobs. You can figure out what the component pieces are, especially the ones that you struggle with, and practice those specific things.
Yeah, I mostly agree. I think there's some things that you get a lot out of from doing interviews that aren't just like practice interviewing. It's also, as we talked about before, practice getting rejected and dealing with like what that means. Like once you've been rejected from 10 jobs, the 11th stings a little less. And if you're able to get good feedback during the process too, you get
That's
a lot
fair.
out of it.
Yeah, and I think maybe also I should just, everything about hiring from me should come with a giant grain of salt, because I've been here too long and too many people know who I am. So interviewing for me is probably an entirely different experience than 99% of people in the world. So I maybe this isn't the right question for me to answer.
That's totally fair as well. And I definitely like have more confidence in interviews and a bunch of weird experiences. Like I interviewed hundreds of candidates at Twitch and helped like really change our interview process. I was really proud of the like work we did there. I, with at least like the subset of devs I talk to a lot in this community, I find most developers aren't interviewing enough and often don't know how much like they're worth because of it. Like they've been stuck in a junior eng position for 3 years now when they're clearly like senior plus, but the position they're in is just like weird and they're struggling to get a promo because people they think of them as a front end dev when they're really full stack and stuff like that. And knowing where you actually are is something I find interviews are a great place for.
That I would totally agree with. And I think the piece that is also really interesting too is thinking about like, where were you when you started? Because a lot of times your first impression becomes an anchor, just makes it hard to move, right? Like this is why there's that joke that devs quit their jobs every 18 to 24 months because that's the only way to get a promotion. And I think that it doesn't have to be that way, but it does require way more deliberate effort to recognize like what were the things that people saw me as when I started. Like if my first feedback was that I didn't do well at collaboration with others, what am I doing to very publicly change that perception of my ability to collaborate so that people don't remember that I got that feedback that one time? And then next year, because they didn't see any changes, they're just going to say, yeah, you still kind of struggle to collaborate with others. You're like, no, I did all these projects, and they didn't see it because you weren't super public about it. Right. And so I think that's, the anchoring that happens. It can also be internal. Like if I join a company and I see all the people who are senior to me as being superior to me, it can be really difficult to see yourself progressing up the ladder in a way that would make them peers or even reports. And that part can be really challenging too. So sometimes that job change ends up being the sort of fresh start that lets you come in at a level that everybody sees you as senior as you start this job. So you don't have to overcome that internal perception or external perception. Oh, that's the junior that I hired 3 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. And I ran into this a lot because I transitioned like disciplines a lot. When I joined Twitch, I was doing Elixir video infrastructure. I moved over to Golang video infrastructure, moved over to deep React TypeScript, moved over to Electron, tried to move into native and mobile apps and got a shitload of pushback when I did that, and eventually just gave off and went and built things for creators more directly. But I constantly got pushback. I remember like a principal engineer at the company sitting me down when I was formally changing my title to front-end engineer, just looked me in the eyes like, you're making a career mistake by doing this, Theo. It's like, what the fuck? I need you to sign off on the promo doc later this month. And because you specifically want me to be like your full stack protege, you're not going to sign off on a promotion doc later now. And like that type of political bullshit, I thought was my fault for a long time, that I hadn't played my cards right. I was making some tactical error. And then I started interviewing and realized not only am I much more senior than I thought, I'm closer to like principal, maybe even like CTO level. So I took a CTO position at a startup and was by far the most competent person there, which I did not like. I do not like being the most competent person in the room. That genuinely frustrates the hell out of me. So I left and hired a bunch of people way more talented than me to work on Ping with me. And now I'm the stupid one all the time. And it's great. And that's where I like to be, where I feel like I am contributing by being around, but not adding a lot of value by being the one running things, because the team kills it. And I have to build into that.
There's a really interesting concept that I've been thinking about a lot. Which is the sort of social archetypes of people who excel in certain roles. And I think Simon Wardley, if you've ever heard of Wardley maps, is the one who popularized this term. But it's this idea that you have, pioneers, settlers, and city planners as sort of social archetypes. And you've got the pioneers or the inventors who are, they're really good at going broad, and they've got this amazing ability to think laterally and come up with lots of interesting solutions to different problems. But they cannot sit still and they cannot follow through. And then you've got the settlers, who are the folks who they really like ideas that are formed enough, like they'll take a prototype and they'll turn it into something healthy. And they like that idea of having a clear goal to shoot for, and they're really good at that. And then you've got people who are more of the city planner type, which what they want is a functioning system, and they want to polish the holy hell out of it, right? And these are the people who just have unbelievably deep expertise in things. They're going to be the ones who are optimizing every single angle of everything that you're doing. And each of those roles is so valuable to have. And each of those roles has deep flaws, right? And so, like, if I look at myself, I'm more in that pioneer kind of inventor role, where like if you put me in a production engineering role, I will cause problems, because my attention is not like, I don't focus on a single problem long enough. I always start to notice that something is wrong and could be better, and then I start inventing solutions. And a lot of those solutions ended up being good, but a lot of them ended up just being, like I said, we over architected the thing, and now we were ready to scale to 1 billion and we still hadn't reached 10,000 yet. And there were so many choices that I made as a production engineer who should have been more of that like settler or city planner archetype that I made as a pioneer that were a huge detriment. Right. And so for me, being in like the content creator role that I do on Learn with Jason, and also in the more leadership role, where my actual function at Netlify is to notice problems and come up with like the beginning of a solution that then people who like, they don't necessarily want to be faced with, here's a pile of data, come up with something productive to do. They instead get to take like a sort of form solution and then turn that into something mature. And then we've got folks on the team who are really good at taking mature solutions and making them like bulletproof. But like, if you don't think about that, if you don't think about not just the role that you're hiring for and the skill level required, but also the humans involved in doing that work, you can find I feel like I've talked to a lot of people who have really struggled and like failed in positions because they wanted to be doing a certain type of work that didn't line up with what they were hired to do. But nobody thought to ask that question. Like, how do you work? What's your attention span on a problem? How do you feel if somebody gives you a problem and says like, I want you to make this thing perfect, right? Because if you tell me that my whole job is the last 10%, I'm immediately going to not take that job. Like that actually that sounds like the worst thing in the world to me. But I've got coworkers, that's exactly what they want. They're like, I don't want to have to solve novel problems. I want to go in and make the perfect system that already solves a problem that people love.
I love that in particular. And like, so a lot of my role is finding the people who have those other pockets in them. Like I vividly remember at Twitch, like when I started leaning more into the management direction, getting a lot of feedback that's, don't you love IC and code? Like, Theo, you're such a big coder. Why would you ever want to become a manager? Like, manager's for the people who don't love code that much. And on the other hand, it's like, but Theo, you're so abrasive and like passionate. You'll never be a good leader because you can't like chill it out and be nice. And it turns out both of those people giving me advice and both of those mindsets were entirely wrong. And those things have ended up being my strengths, because like my ability to sit down and grind something out when it needs to be grinded out means that I'm able to relate to my team better. So I'm able to keep stress levels lower when like something comes in unexpectedly. I can jump on it too, and I can maintain that level of involvement and respect from my team as a result of it. And on the
Absolutely.
other side, I like my passion allows for people in those different positions to get excited about things in ways that they weren't before, and maybe challenge themselves to build in ways that they're not as used to.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, we've now apparently reached the spicy takes because it just got way too hot in my office.
I'm accidentally CPU encoding my stream right now, so I feel that really hard.
So yeah, if it looks like I'm sweating, it's not because I'm uncomfortable. It's just really, really hot in my office.
Totally relatable. For me, it's both. And I'm sure you can see it. Oh, wow, you actually can't for once. That's nice. Cool. Normally, I keep the camera angle perfectly cut so you can't see sweat stains. Yeah, very painfully relatable. I really like this. It was the three groups were like the innovators, the settlers, and the city planners, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I think pioneer, settlers, and city planners. I can I'll find a
interesting. Yeah, I think that founders are people who can straddle the line between pioneers and settlers. Like they find ground and they camp it out fucking hard to the point where it's become a city, and then they begrudgingly move over long enough for the city planner to take over from there as they go and like pioneer out and settle new land. But like I see my role as pioneering for as short a time as possible so I can get to settling and then put my like stake down hard as hell so it can eventually become a city.
Yeah. Yeah, right. And I think it's like most personality types, it's going to happen on a spectrum. Like you don't have introverts and extroverts. You've got people who fall somewhere. I'm right on the middle, right? Like I want 3 days of heavy people time, and then I want 4 days of sitting in a dark room with no human contact whatsoever.
The thing I was just mentioning, and I am curious what your thoughts are on this, was the content creator being the in-between of the city planner and the pioneer. And I think that to succeed as a creator is a very different skill set than to succeed as an engineer. I just put up a video, actually, second last video I put on my channel, where I went really in depth on the idea that I learned nothing about being a founder from engineering, and I learned a ton about it from my YouTube channel, because the mindset of, there's like a specific mindset of not just like how good can you be at your peak and what's the best things can be that I think as engineers we're usually striving for. It's like we're not scared to take a week off. We work hard to make things happen in the highest quality that we can, but we aren't scared to like take a step back or pass on a problem, where in the creator and the founder world, those are the scariest possible things, are overcommitting, stepping away, and handing off without full understanding and confidence. And on YouTube in particular, it's not about how good you could be at your peak. It's how productive can you be at your floor when you feel like shit, when nothing's working, when everything's going to hell. Can you still get videos out? And what do those videos look like? Because you're going to spend a lot of time on that floor. And that's what being a founder is too. It's not about the highs. It's about how you survive and thrive during the lows. We haven't talked about smash burgers yet.
We haven't talked about smash burgers yet. We definitely should talk about those. So, okay. So smash burgers. I don't know if I've ever even asked you like the baseline question. Like, are you a burger fan?
Yes. Very, very big burger fan.
All right. And what's your preference? Like, are you one of the like, give me a burger that's as tall as my head, that's, a pound of beef, or are you more on the thin patty side? Where do you land?
I could enjoy one of the like thick patties if done properly, but I find that they're often an excuse for like not really knowing how to cook a burger correctly. And a proper like thinner patty can be cooked more properly. Like as a big fan of a proper like rare, still kind of breathing steak, burgers are the wrong place to go that rare, and those giant burgers are inviting being poorly cooked.
Yeah, right. I mean, they're either like too overdone, at which point it's like, okay, I guess I'll eat it. But more, I think what I struggle with more with the really thick burgers is that I don't know why it inspires everybody to put 19 different toppings on it. But a core theme in my life is editing, right? Like when you have a million ideas, what makes somebody good at their craft is being able to not do most of them. You have to be able to look at 1,000 good ideas and then say, I'm only going to do these 3. Right. So when you're looking at a burger and you think, I could put an onion ring on this, I could put bacon on this, I could put a farm fresh egg on this. It's like, look, don't don't do that. That's not what it's for.
Once the toppings line in like the menu at the restaurant has to wrap to the next line, you know that's you overcommitted. Yeah.
I mean, my general approach to a smash burger is just floor simple, right? It's 2.5 ounce burger balls, right? So they're really thin patties smashed onto a griddle that's like 500 degrees so that they immediately caramelize. And the only thing you put on them is like salt and pepper, some shredded iceberg lettuce because you need something to soak up the grease on the bottom bun. You toast your buns, you get a potato bun or a brioche bun, whatever's on hand, and then you put a little burger sauce on that. And really good pickles. Like you got to put some really good pickles on there. And if you're looking for a little extra crunch, you can do like diced white onions in the shredded lettuce, and that's always really nice. But it's like, it's like 3 toppings. That's all you need. They keep it really, really simple, and you got to put American cheese on it because that's the glue that holds your like smashed within an inch of its life burger together.
The American cheese, like I get it. American cheese is like so bad and it's basically just plastic, all that shit. Yeah. Unlike plastic, it melts really elegantly and holds things together. I guess kind of like plastic in that sense. But yeah, American cheese holds things together great.
It might be plastic. I don't even think it's actually called cheese. It's like it's a dairy product or something. But I have for anybody who's interested in like the specifics of how I do it, I have this site called burgers.dev, which is a public beef site that I have with Sarah Drasner. And it's just me trolling her because Sarah is a big believer in the sous vide burger, where she does a thicker patty and cooks it perfectly using sous vide and then uses like a blowtorch to get the sear on it, which is... I wouldn't do it like that.
This is like the real Stack Wars, guys. Like if you thought I was bad talking about Angular, this is where it really cuts deep.
But so anyway, so Sarah and I started talking about this pre-pandemic. We were going to have a burger face off and do this whole thing. And now she's now the director of web, or is that her official title is something absurd. She's in charge of the whole internet at Google. And it's now
director of engineering for web and Chrome, if I recall.
Yes, like she is very busy. And my new job also keeps me very busy. So we have not been able to put this burger showdown on the books yet. But when it happens, I am going to win. Actually, you want me to show you the most ridiculous thing second most ridiculous thing I've ever done?
Oh God.
Is I made a trophy. Let me go get it.
Should I be as scared as I am, chat? Oh man. Oh man. Let me switch to just your cam so you can get a close up of that.
So this, yeah. Are you gonna focus? Focus. Come on. All right, we'll just hold it back here so that it's in focus. This is the championship belt for Smashburger. Well, it's going to be for a Smashburger, but it could theoretically, if Sarah pulls out a miracle, be the sous vide burger, or splash burger, as I've taken to calling it. But that's the belt. It's absolutely ridiculous. It turns out these are fairly affordable to make. So if you want to troll your friends, you can just head on down to the local trophy store and say, I would like a championship belt, and they'll make one for you.
Primagen next programming showdown. Let's get some belts made. I have so many ideas now. God, making belts.
Yes.
This piece of information is very dangerous for me to have.
Okay, so here's something that I've learned. This is maybe the best argument for why somebody needs to come and like take away all of my independent decision making. Is I figured out that if you ask people the right questions, you can get literally anything custom made. And so
I still have to order my corgis. I forgot.
The pandemic. During the pandemic, I drew these little things, and I was like, that was a way I was keeping myself entertained, was by making little drawings of, you know, corgis and ice cream and whatever else. And then somebody said, you should make a real rubber duck. And I was like, I don't know, let me see how it takes. So I emailed somebody. I work with a company called Corporate Couture that does fulfillment on swag stores. That's who I use for Gatsby and Netlify, and I use them myself. And they were like, oh, we can probably figure that out. So they ended up calling around to a bunch of places. And I finally ended up on the phone with a manufacturing plant in China. And they were like, yeah, we'll take that drawing and like carve a little clay model. So they did some like hand carved clay models of these corgi ducks. And I was like, this is amazing. Can you make them? And they were like, yeah, we'll make you a sample. So they made me a sample and they sent me this. And I was like, okay, I want these. How do I get them? They're like, well, the minimum order is 1,000. I was like, oh no. But I ordered them. So now I have 1,000 corgi ducks. So please buy one because I have so many.
Oh man, I was expecting like 100 to 500 for the minimum. I was not expecting an extra zero there. Do you have the link? Oh, you just posted it in chat. Yeah, I will order one of these first thing post show. So make sure we don't sell at least 1,000 of them. Leave one for me.
If y'all go and buy 1,000 of these ducks right now, it may
You'll
actually
order another 1,000.
save my marriage. I will immediately order another 1,000.
The video of you putting all of them in like the lake in the back was the funniest thing I've ever seen.
That was my partner was really not thrilled with the decision to purchase all of these. But she's a trooper, and so she was willing to put up with my nonsense. Very much. You know,
John in chat,
why
please help me budget. My family is starving.
You are not wrong. I was trying to find this is the TikTok. I'll drop it in a couple channels here.
I'm gonna play this now.
I put 20 rubber rainbow corgi ducks into my partner's fountain.
Be free. Why are you like this? Nobody thinks you're funny.
I don't know how anybody could not think that's the funniest thing ever. Honestly, I cried laughing when I saw that clip. The beef free.
That is also it is my only TikTok. I have not. I feel like that one happened so organically, and then I was like, I should do another TikTok, and I was like, it's not gonna be better.
Yeah.
I should just stop. Go out as a one-hit wonder.
It's one of the problems of setting such a high bar going in is it's really hard to follow up. Like my first real stream was with Dan Abramov doing a mock interview, and it just took me a month to like work up to doing another like interview stream or just a stream at all. It's like, oh, I'll never have more than 20 views ever again. Like that was such a crazy moment. And
you just start at the top, right? I feel the same way. I had like a couple moments where I had like Cassidy Williams on my stream and Sarah Drasner on my stream, and they're just, you know, they just have such amazing audiences. And I was like, okay, so that's the top. I'll just slide back down to my own level here and plod along for the rest of the time.
Yep. I have been really impressed with how quickly the space has grown. I think there's a lot of different things that led to that, but the one that I think like there's like a lot of silly things that have helped, like the software and game dev category appearing, the like COVID resulting in a lot more people going online to have dev conversations. And to be frank, people like Primagen and Fireship pushing really hard to make more senior technical content more prolific. And obviously the work you've done as well with learning with Jason. But I feel like we're nowhere near the ceiling for this type of like dev content right now. It feels like we're just getting started. The ramp up's been nuts. The metrics I've seen on all of our channels have been crazy. Like we're just getting started in this space, I think.
Yeah, and I think the piece that's really interesting to me too is the learning that happens in a streaming environment is so different than the learning that happens when you watch even a video tutorial or something, right? Because the thing that I find really interesting about expertise is that it's up to a certain point, it's just knowing stuff. I know what to Google. I know what this thing is called. I've seen this pattern before. But then there's this whole thing of just experts have instincts. And there's so many little things that an expert does as they work through a problem that they will never realize that they do consciously, that they'll never call out or write an article about or anything like that. They just do it while they're in the middle of another task. And you go, wait, what was that? And I've noticed that on my stream, the things that tend to be what really sticks with people aren't like the macro topic. It's not like here we're going to, a few of them obviously have taken off and become that sort of thing, but most of them, it's like, we're going to build, a thing we'll build X with Y. And that is useful, but where people really get takeaways, where the clips happen, where people email me and say, you changed my dev life, is they'll see some shortcut that I've used or some alias I've set up or some tool that I have configured over here this way. And they look at it, they go, oh, that makes my life so much easier. And then they just those little efficiency tips, those little, like, my instinct is, instead of doing this, I do that. Here's where I look first when I see a bug. Like, those sorts of things that's like, I think why you used to have journeymen and craftsmen where they would kind of pair together, is because I can study the academia of anything forever, but you never learn the craft without watching somebody who's been doing it longer and just knows the little tricks.
Absolutely. And I think less of that is the actual value of the tricks and more so the identity that comes alongside of them. Like the familiarity of I know these things, I have the confidence and the ownership of the tool I'm crafting with. Like, knowing every shortcut in VS Code, I firmly believe is not going to make you much faster as an engineer, but it will make you feel like you own that tool much harder, and it will make your own confidence and like thoroughness in your approach significantly better.
Yeah. I feel pretty strongly there's like an 80-20 on shortcuts and tooling and all that.
Be careful. There's a lot of Vim people here.
And honestly, there are definitely things that I've seen that I cannot believe how fast people are in Vim. And like, yeah. I'm not a Vim user. I've tried to be a Vim user, and I'm not willing to put in the ramp up time to become fast. Because I think I started learning it after I was already fast in other tools. So when I look at it, I'm like, I'm just frustrated by this. But the speed with which somebody is just completely contained in Vim and is able to do these amazing things is incredible. But then when you look at somebody who really does optimize for, like, I know 100% of the keyboard shortcuts in Figma or VS Code or whatever it is, it's like that 100% code coverage thing. Like, it's cool, but it doesn't necessarily make things better. There's like a threshold beyond which you're just doing it for the points, not doing it for the efficiency, right? And so I'm very much like, I'm going to set this tool up until it solves the problem I have right now. And when I have a new problem, I will see if this tool solves it, and then I'll learn a new thing about this tool. I'm not a completionist by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, there's it's like a weird slight tangent. There's a YouTube video that I think way too much about that has shaped a lot of my own philosophy around like adopting technologies and tools. There was a showdown between two YouTube editors. It was Tanner, who was at the time the editor for Linus Tech Tips, who had 3 keyboards with custom key layouts that he would use in his crazy setup in Premiere, with like the keyboards had different like keycaps on them specifically for his Premiere bindings. He customized this crazy setup versus iJustine on her MacBook on her lap in Final Cut. And just like the time it took for these two to set up and comparing that was hilarious. They like had a desk, and 95% of the desk was Tanner and his crazy like multi-monitor setup and all this crazy shit. They had the same source footage. Their goal is to make a good, compelling edit. And iJustine's edit was better in the same amount of time. And that was just mind-blowing for me.
I've seen that video, and yeah, I mean, it's that whole thing where like a poor craftsman blames his tools sort of thing. And I think that when you watch, I am absolutely a gearhead. Like my camera setup is bonkers, and I've got like effects lights behind me, and I've got 2 big old key lights, and I know what I am. I know what I But at the same point, I have no illusions that buying this gear is what caused me to build an audience or have Learn with Jason become something that people cite as, like to have you talk about it as something you think of when you think about content creation in dev. It's definitely not because I bought a Sony FX3. I bought the FX3 because I wanted bokeh. That's all. I got the good camera and the good lens so that my background would be blurred out and I'd look like a cool hipster. That's all I wanted.
And
but that
I
was
spent
something
$300 on my Panasonic Lumix G7, and we look comparable. So you don't have to go all out.
Exactly, right? Like it's not the gear. It's like the gear is a hobby. The tools can become a hobby. Like, being a completionist in all of the ins and outs of how something works, it can make you more efficient. But, a musician like Jacob Collier, who knows literally everything about music, like deep music theory knowledge and can play every instrument and all these things, isn't necessarily making better music than the Ramones. I mean, like technically, sure, but like who listens to more of what, right? Like the Ramones can barely play their goddamn instruments, and yet they're out there making music and people really love it. So I think it's very much about the approach and the consistency and the willingness to just try things and learn and adapt that really makes the big difference. And like the tools are a thing that's, it's like the bonus after you've already built a consistent creation habit and after you've, done these other things. I just heard somebody like fall down in my house. I hope everybody's okay.
You need to go check on people. It's totally fine. I understand.
No, people are still talking normally. Whatever it was, it's fine.
Temporary pain. My cats have been weirdly quiet. I'm now suspicious too. Mark, let me know if the cats are causing problems out there, because they've been not causing problems in here, which is a nice change. We have been going for 2 hours. I don't want to keep you for too long, but I definitely want to open up the opportunity for chat questions if y'all have anything that we didn't cover here. As we wait, there's something we touched on a bit that I feel like we went quite into it, as much as I wanted to, and I'm curious where does GraphQL fall in your mind in the world of JAMStack? We touched on it a bit, but like, what is the relationship there?
I don't know that GraphQL has a relationship to JAMStack specifically. Like you can use it in a way that would be JAMStack and in a way that's not. But I think like GraphQL for me at least is a tool for wrangling unruly data. And that's why I got into it to start was, again, at IBM, 30-something microservices. They've all got different APIs. Nobody's documenting anything. Nobody wants to talk to each other. I needed a way for front-end devs to know what the hell was going on in the system. And I needed a way for the back-end devs to be on the hook to tell one person when something changed, because we were having all these breaking changes because they were like, well, there's too many people to deal with. We just wait for people to tell us it's broken, and then we'll tell them what's going on. And obviously that's not great in a production system. So with GraphQL, what I was able to do is it was federated data, where I built, at the time, nothing existed for this. So I built out a tool that I called Gramps that was a GraphQL federation. It was a tiny little thing that you hooked on top of your APIs that kind of inferred what your REST data looked like and built a GraphQL schema out of it. And then you plugged those things together into a single GraphQL endpoint so that the front-end teams could then introspect and you would get a clear error if data was missing. And we also gave analytics back to the back-end teams to let them know that like, hey, some of these bespoke things that you put together, like nobody uses it. And this field is super slow. So stop making that query because 0 requests have gone through in the last month. So as a communication tool, I really like GraphQL. I usually don't set up GraphQL on my own projects because I feel like it's a problem to solve existing complexity, not necessarily something that helps when you don't have complexity. It feels like adding complexity, right? And typically on a greenfield project, the initial startup cost of setting up GraphQL is pretty high. The only exception to that rule for me, at least, is that I will set up GraphQL if I need WebSockets, because the tooling around GraphQL subscriptions is easier for me to understand than the tooling around like having a streaming database update that I have to connect to some other system that then has to connect to my front end that I then update the front end with. And part of that could be that I just don't know the tools, right? Like I learned GraphQL subscriptions as one of the first like really truly real-time updating systems that I was building. So I never had occasion to go learn what has improved since before GraphQL.
That's really interesting because like GraphQL subscriptions are something I've seen shipped in experiments, but I've never seen shipped in like a major production application. And I've seen like dozens of GraphQL deployments. Like subscriptions aren't officially part of the GraphQL spec yet, and it's like a very bleeding edge thing to do that. And a lot of like core GraphQL tech doesn't even support them.
Yeah, it's definitely the sort of thing that like I've used it real sparingly. I think I've set up 2 of these ever. And one of them is for my own stream because I needed to pull together a bunch of real-time events, and I didn't want to have a bunch of different WebSockets open on my site. So I put it all into a GraphQL subscription. And I wanted some stuff that wasn't actually real-time, like, webhooks and things like that to alert out. And I was like, well, I've already got this GraphQL thing, so let's just feed those events in as well. So for me, it was a way to just calm some complexity between like TMI.js for Twitch and some stuff from Sanity, which I use as the headless CMS for Learn with Jason, and Discord bot stuff, and just all these places where data comes in and things happen. I wanted a way to just pull that all into a single subscription. So for me, and again, I wouldn't call what I'm building at Learn with Jason a big production system. It's very much like I solved the problem for myself. But in that instance, GraphQL subscription solved it real quick for me. So I was like, cool, I can get this done in a day and never have to think about it again.
That's not the experience I've heard with GraphQL subscriptions before, but it's really cool that like the tech you use let you adopt those in a relatively seamless way. Like that was the promise of it, and it delivered for you. I've never heard that happening before, so I'm genuinely hyped, and that's cool to hear.
I think it comes with the caveat of I spent 12 months at IBM, like really getting into the GraphQL spec and really learning how things like Apollo and Urkel worked under the hood, and really getting buried into that community. So I think a lot of my instincts for GraphQL are good now, in a way that is probably not true, which is and probably informing a lot of what's going well for me in my GraphQL experience. So take my GraphQL stuff with a grain of salt, because I was able to put it together in a day. Plus, it's like the plumber, right? Like the plumber knows exactly where to hit on the thing because they've been doing it for 25 years.
There's also a very real compromise as soon as you add like WebSockets to a lot of the systems that we talk about here in JAMStack land, that now you need a server. It's no longer serverless architecture, because there has to be a box that is maintaining a connection that has state on it. And I try my goddamn hardest to keep that type of building as far away from my systems as possible. I really don't like the idea of avoidable state. And whenever I can make a WebSocket system, like we're in a ping call right now. We have a third-party WebSocket service that has a presence product that we put up data that's like, which devices do you have like on your computer? Which one are you using right now? And from those WebSocket presence connections, the UI is able to infer specific behaviors. The thing we added on top of that for like, I change my username, how do users get the update? On the username change endpoint that I hit through a TRPC use mutation, it first updates a DB, and then after that, it broadcasts a message with the ID of that query to the call. So anybody who has that data currently on stream or on their screen refetches that data in a batch request. The result being,
nice.
It's not like the webhook event or the WebSocket event has the updated data. It has the key that needs to be updated, and then the client can invalidate and fetch the new data itself there. That way I've decoupled the event system from the storage system, from the API, with a slight latency hit, because the event doesn't trigger the update on the client. The event tells the client to then go do an update, but that's a small cost for the absurd benefit of proper decoupling of these things.
Yeah, it sounds way better than the way that I built it. Mine is a big old mess. Mine is just a pile. Like I needed a thing to work, and I was like, no, that'll be fine. I know nobody but me needs to use this. And every time I have to debug it, I hate it, because I feel the same way. Like I really don't want long running services. I really don't want to have to worry about server uptime and stuff like that. So yeah, if I were to build it again today, after having this conversation, I probably would be looking into something more similar to what you're doing.
Yeah, I would definitely love to show you a bit of the chaotic way we build things at Ping. I think you would at first hate it because of how tightly coupled things are, but slowly grow to love it when you realize that tight coupling results in so little code doing so much, and all of the pieces making sense in a way where, like, one of my favorite moments, I've went on this rant a few times. I'm sure a lot of people in chat are going to be like, oh, not this one again. One of my first hires at Ping is they were a ramen chef before they started working at Ping. They hit me up via email with a link to their GitHub full of game engines they built themselves in Zig for fun. Super talented developer that just didn't know where they were at in their career. So I pulled them on to work at Ping. They never used TypeScript, never built web apps, never built APIs before. But due to the simplicity of like the TRPC, Next.js, Fullstack type safe solution we had, they were able to start building features really quick. In particular, they built a lot of our admin tools for us to like manage calls behind the scenes, keep track of like whose rooms are activated, stuff like that.
Yeah.
6 months in, we started building the video recording infrastructure that we're working on now for you in the very near future, hopefully, if all goes well. Maybe but before TwitchCon, we'll be able to ship that. Fingers crossed.
This is for everybody watching who hasn't heard. I bully Theo about this weekly.
Yes, as you should. This is a huge part of what keeps us on top of things. Right now, I think I mentioned this before, our recording infrastructure is you click a broken button in the admin panel as a user that just recently started showing text that said recording so that you know you're recording finally. That was a recent change. Really hyped on that one. And then when you're done recording, you DM me. I go into the database, I find the names of all of the file dumps in our S3, and I manually transcode those on my laptop and then send them via Google Drive. So we want to automate all of that because it sucks.
Yes.
And we're close.
Yeah. I mean, most of all, it sucks for you, I think.
Yeah. It is what it is.
But I guess that's the right way to do feature. That's the right way to do feature
things that don't
development,
scale.
right? Is like make it painful for the CEO so that prioritization happens. Right?
No, absolutely. Straight up. It's a huge part of how we validate the product. Like if I'm not annoyed by the amount of transcoding I'm doing, the product isn't viable enough for us to spend the engineering effort. But if I'm annoyed, that needs to be a high priority because people actually want it. If we make a good enough product, we're good in that sense. The reason I brought this whole story up is that this engineer is like largely leading that project. And we sat down, we spec'd the whole thing out. We drew fancy diagrams. We had a pretty solid plan figured out. The only question they had at the end, and I will never forget this moment. Hey, Theo, I feel bad asking this, but I should really know by now. What's an endpoint? They've been working for me for 6 months, building all these crazy solutions, making Ping work. And the thought of an endpoint was a foreign concept because they wrote functions in the server folder and then called them in the client folder. What's an endpoint? There's no endpoint in that world. And I realized like, oh, that's the level of complexity, like the dimensions of complexity we have avoided. We don't think in those things. We write functions and call them.
Yeah, and I do think this is where you and I are very philosophically aligned with like different practical choices. Is the whole goal is to just eliminate hurdles for people. Like, how do we make somebody productive on their first day? That's a metric for us at Netlify. Is like, are people able to open their first pull request within 24 hours of their start date? Because you should be able to ramp up that fast. Like, our dev environment should be friendly enough, our code base should be understandable enough that you can go in and make meaningful contributions on day one. And so I think it kind of gets back to this whole thing around like, why do you design software anyway? It's always being designed to help human people understand what we're telling the computers to do, and to help make them by default make better choices. And that's the whole thing, right? Anything else beyond that is just our own experiences, our own opinions informing those underlying points. Absolutely agree. I love that way of thinking about it. We're all just trying to make computers do the right thing for our users. And the simpler you can make it, the better. Yeah. Yes. 100%. I do see some awesome questions coming in, so I want to make sure we get to some of these. One I really like from Deva, I feel like I had the same misconception coming in a bit. The question is, what are the largest and most complex projects and scales you've seen like JAMStack working for, as they personally assumed JAMStack was an approach more for small to medium-sized projects? So most complex product would probably be the Twilio dashboard, or maybe the Peloton embedded apps, like on the bikes themselves, are both hosted on the other setup as JAMStack apps. The biggest scale is probably Riot Games. So like League of Legends and all that. They're in the process of migrating a lot of their sites over, which has been steadily setting bandwidth records for us. But what was really interesting actually is I'm not going to say any details because I don't have them and I don't want to misquote anything. But in both bandwidth and performance, they saw notable improvements over what they were doing before, which was like aggressively tuned manual caching. And so it was, you know, the architectural choices that they've made have eliminated a lot of the things that were causing them to both slow down and send more data over the wire. It again, by, you know, just the natural enforcement of that JAMStack stuff causes some really good architectural bonuses.
I love when less work ends up being more performant. I still remember when I was fresh out of Twitch, I had been managing the Webpack configs for a bunch of internal projects and helping with the one for all of Twitch. So one of my first web dev tasks ever was a Webpack 2 to Webpack 4 move. I don't know how I survived, but I'm still here. I think this is why I don't like tools in the space. But yeah, the reason I brought that up is when I left, I was using Snowpack more and more. Then I started using Vite. And I'd become so used to writing custom bundle splitting configs, like making my own chaotic like file architectures just to do bundle splitting correctly. And I did all of that work and started hitting memory errors in my build because I'd done so much custom work in rollup through Vite. And I accidentally renamed the key for those bundles, so it wasn't making any of them. And the output when I did a bundle analysis was better than any of the manual chunking I had ever done. And I realized, I am overbuilding a worse solution here than what the tool does for me if I react.lazy in 3 places. I need to just do that and get over my shit. And all of a sudden, everything worked way faster.
So you're touching on something that I think is this again comes down to, like, I think developers, especially the folks who really get amped up about this stuff, are also having a lot of fun as they do their jobs, because so much pain that I see when I get, you know, as part of my role, I get brought onto like sales calls, or I sometimes do consulting on the side for companies. And when I get brought into a code base, so much of what I see is, well, we didn't want to use the off-the-shelf tools, so we started building this thing, and then we built this system, and we architected this on top of it. And then we accidentally took down production for 3 days because one cache invalidation was causing the other cache to prime, which would then break the third cache. And then we couldn't figure out how to get them all to clear at the same time. So we were just down for 3 days. And like that's a true story for a site that's way too big to ever be down. And when you hear these stories and then you ask them what they're doing, you like look at the code, you're like, okay, but if you just like any pre-packaged CDN would do what you're asking for and never ever run that risk. And they're like, well, yeah, but we thought that we could do it like better because of this specific requirement. It's like, yeah, okay, but you are now basically saying, okay, company that employs, like, actively recruits the best caching specialists in the world to solve this problem and pays them an exorbitant amount of money to focus their full-time effort on making caching better. You, as a React dev or a Next dev, are saying, that's not good enough. I'm going to go fuck with an Akamai cache until ours is faster. It's like, of course that's going to cause you problems. Of course you're going to suffer. Like, trust the experts to be experts. And like, when a tool has given you a default config, if you don't have rock solid data that the thing it does by default is actively your biggest problem, please don't touch it. Like, use the defaults. They're there for a reason. In modern tooling is built to be good at this. Like Vite and most of the, you know, the CDN platforms. Like, I know that at Netlify, the vast majority of our tickets are like, fix this edge case of caching, make sure that this invalidation works in under a few seconds, like do this, where that's all they do all day. Right. So when people come in and they're like, yeah, but I want to turn that off and use my own cache headers, it's like, I mean, we'll let you, but please don't.
Yep. I have seen so much chaos around caching, and Redis as a phenomenal product, it is the wrong place to cache your HTML. Like, I am so confused in some of the use cases. I've seen people like reinventing CDNs and then running code on the edge when what they really want is an HTML file. that gets revalidated every once in a while. And it's like the amount of architecture that I've been able to stop thinking about through a combination of Netlify and Vercel making serverless functions and edge deployments so easy, and CDNs making cache layers basically free, have resulted in me not thinking about categories of problems that I used to have to employ teams for. And you can still employ that team if you want to, but now you're at a huge disadvantage. And when I look at a company like Twitch, who is directly competing with us and our core product now at Ping, they have a team of 20 engineers that took 9 months to build a product with half the features that's a quarter as good as what we built. And we can run circles around them with our little 4-person team because we are using the tools that let us move faster. We're not reinventing the things or suffering from a lot of not invented here syndrome around problems like planet scale is a whole category of problems I used to care way too much about. Like I used to be a database nerd and cared all about the different ways to scale your DBs, and you're making all of our data infrastructure the fastest in the world. And I get read times in SF from the planet scale DB edge that are within 10% of
that's bonkers.
And I have no infrastructure. That's literally just curling an endpoint.
So freaking cool. Yeah, I the database space in general right now is remarkable. Like I'm watching so many companies, because like Planet Scale kind of exploded onto the scene. And you know, obviously what they're doing is giving front-end developers access to MySQL in a way that doesn't hurt. And then we've got this explosion of other companies trying all sorts of things, you know, like Fauna with their bespoke query language and what they're doing. And then companies like Supabase and others that are, now we've got some that are like completely abstracted away. Like I just looked at something called Convex, where it's just a JavaScript API and like everything else is magic. And okay. I mean, I hope they get it right. Like it's super cool. But it feels like databases are revolutionizing right now, because I think we've also just started to accept that probably most apps make more sense if they're serverless or edge functions rather than being long-running servers. So databases should be built for that. How do you get a serverless native database, an edge native database? And so the category of problems that I think was ignored for a really long time is suddenly getting a lot of attention, and there's a huge amount of investment cash going into it, a huge amount of developer hours going into it, and like I'm just so blown away by what Planet Scale is doing.
The thing I really like about Planet Scale, especially when you compare it to things like what like Supabase or Convex are doing, is that they're not trying to take away anything beyond the database layer. Like I still connect through Prisma almost entirely when I'm working with my Planet Scale databases. I'm starting to write my own custom Keasley wrapper so I can do edge routing in a type safe way without having to like have the whole Prisma client. I have some working demos on my GitHub if you scroll through and find them. But Planet Scale hasn't taken away ownership in their like development, and that's what's so cool for me, is it took away the awful configuration window I used to go into and panic whenever I had to scale up my database in AWS. Supabase still has one of those. You will hit a scaling limit someday and have to scale up your database and just be offline for a while. That's the reality of those other offers or offerings. Planet Scale took away that interface and that dimension of problems without taking away my ownership of my technology at the same time. And that's what's so magic for me with Planet Scale, is what it represents there as a dimension reducer of problems without taking ownership away in the process. Normally, when you have one of those things, you have to have both. They're one of the rare cases where that didn't happen.
I think, yeah, you're actually bringing up something I think really important. And I think the way I was saying it was kind of clumsy, but talking about this idea of like, don't try to hire experts, hire tools that already hired experts, right? And when you're saying this this idea of reducing dimensions, I like the idea of like, it's a good way to put it. Like the apps are very highly dimensional. There are a million like vectors that impact how an app works, right? And you can have two apps with the same stack, and one of them will be wildly dysfunctional and like impossible to ship, and one of them will be, you know, it'll be live in seconds. And I've walked between teams in the same company that use the exact same starter code, and they've just made choices in the way that they invent things, they pull other people's code in and reverse engineer it and build their own version. And then every single time you want to make a change, it's not just, does the tool we use support that feature? It's, does the tool that we rip off support that feature so that we can go figure out how it works and then reverse engineer it and then do all the acceptance testing at the base layers so that we can bring it up to the middle layer and make sure that all of that code is updated. And then we can go up a layer again. And then finally, you know, it's like weeks of code. And like you said, you have to hire people to do that. Like you can't maintain that code on a single dev, because even if you have one dev that can do all that work, they will burn out and they will be a huge
bus factor.
Like a bus factor is
Yep.
a little violent way to put
That's
it,
fair.
but you can call it, I call it vacation tolerance. How many people can be on vacation before you're in huge trouble? And if your vacation tolerance is 1, oh man, you're screwed. Especially when you've got 5 layers of code that's all dependent on this one person who's the only person who has the full context. And yeah, oh my God, I think this is the thing that I find most exciting about this idea of the shorthand I've been using for it is composable architecture. You've got tons and tons of platform as a service, database as a service, software as a service, CMS as a service, e-commerce as a service. Each one of these is now delivering something that is maintained and managed by an expert team. And I, as a developer, only ever need to understand how to interact with a REST endpoint, a GraphQL endpoint, or a JavaScript SDK. And if I have those 3 skills, which fall very squarely within my own skill set as what would be called a front-end developer of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, I learn those things, and now I can build extraordinarily complex apps in 2 hours, 24 hours, a week, right? And the fact that you can go spin up a site that's got a video player and also a swag store and also a upcoming schedule and also some like live interactivity for when you do go live. You know, the Learn with Jason site I built in a couple of weekends, and it's got so much functionality in it because I just let other people do all the work. I went to all these experts and I used their tools, and I was able to, you know, like I threw it all together real fast. And I'm looking at re-architecting the shop. I built almost feature complete shop based on Remix and Shopify in like 90 minutes on a stream. It's just wild how much you can do now with the tools that are out there. If you can get over that fear that letting somebody else do work somehow makes you less effective as a developer or will somehow hinder you from being able to be productive.
Totally agree. I think there's an important line worth drawing. And this kind of goes back to the build versus buy earlier. One of the other questions in chat actually about your use of like headless CMS tools is I think it's really important to understand what ownership you're giving up when you make one of those decisions. Like the choice to use something like Netlify plus Planet Scale, build your own Prisma layer, and then use a WebSocket layer through something like what's it called? Like or Pusher or Ably, any of those services? Or do you go with something like Firestore, or do you just give up and go with WordPress or Wix? I would consider a lot of these tools leaning into the Wix direction where it's taking away your agency and your control, especially if it's not built on open standards that you can gut. I think Supabase is a really interesting like on the line product in that sense, where it has an open source database layer that is Postgres. You can connect to the Postgres directly, and the whole project itself is open source, so you could self-host Supabase if you really wanted to. But the amount of ownership that you give up when you use their JS client instead of connecting to that database directly is massive. You're going to run into scale problems. You're going to have to move off, and that's going to be a pain. When you have pieces that understand the scope of where their ownership ends, well, they are much more modular. And composability, I believe, should imply modularity. And I've seen way too many solutions that don't. I really like Netlify and Vercel in particular for how standout they are in this way. Neither are stateful. You cannot host your state on Netlify or Vercel. If you write to a file store, like so it makes a request, you write to a file, the next request, that file doesn't exist anymore. And the number of people we've had that are like, I deployed my T3 app with SQLite, and as soon as like I refresh, the data's gone. What's happening? It's like, there's no data there. This is by design. The decoupling of your state from your runtime gives you more ownership and control of both. and reduces the complexity of your application. So I look for opportunities like that rather than ones that like put a wall between me and some part of my application so I don't think about it anymore.
I think you're absolutely right. And I would add one more slider to that decision making, which is how long does this thing need to live?
Yes.
Right. So like if I'm standing up, for example, I'm working on JAMStack Conf is coming up November 7th and 8th, right? And so for that event, we want to build an app that will let people play a version of bingo. And I promise you that app is not going to survive too much longer than after JAMStack Conf. So I don't care about giving up the ownership. I will not hit scale problems because it's not going to evolve. It's not going to become anything more than it is, right? So in that case, I kind of like Supabase because it's got the auth built in. It's got the whole CRUD set up, and it's got real time. And I can just say, right, Supabase, do you take care of this? And then, you know, if this ever did grow into something where we spin it off and turn it into its own startup, sure, we'll probably rip out Supabase and re-architect with something that's going to scale better. But for a short-lived app that is most likely going to survive for, call it 3 weeks, I don't care. Give me the thing that's the fastest time to completion. And if that means giving up a lot of ownership over the back end, if I don't ever need to maintain it, if I don't ever need to iterate on this idea, I really like the idea of being able to just say, oh, that's an app in a box for my entire dashboard. Right. So I think there's also that scale of like, how long lived is it really? Like, be honest with yourself. Will this still be a thing you use next year? And does it need to be ready to be iterated on and expanded and scaled? Or is this a one-off that you're going to use for a year or use for a few months, and then it's going to be replaced by something else next year?
I mostly agree. The two things I would push back on, the first is you don't know if your thing can handle the scale until you handle it. And I've seen a lot of cases of people building, and like, I don't mean to be calling out Supabase. I do genuinely love the company and the product, but I've seen too many instances where somebody was building an app for like a one-time event and it immediately crumbled under the weight of the traffic for that event, even though it was just going to be a one-day thing. And ultimately, those engineers had to move off of Supabase because it took so long to try and scale up and get it to the right point. Even though it was only going to be for one day, they had to scale up for a whole month and switch the database over and get all these weird compute numbers that don't really matter to them. They just wanted a database that would be, they would charge for their usage. In Supabase's experience, because it is an abstraction on top of a traditional server that you don't own, results in problems being something that get solved on Supabase's time, not your own. And that's why I'm so scared of losing that ownership, is when you do run into a problem, even on a short scale, the likelihood that you can own and address that problem is lower. The other side, and this is the angle that I've been fighting at really hard for a while now, is what if we didn't have to make the compromise? What if you could have the agility you get from something like Supabase without giving up the ownership of it? And that is what we're striving for with Create T3 app. It's get auth set up in a way you own with NextAuth. Get database set up in a way you own with Prisma. Get your infrastructure set up in a way you own with Next.js, and TRPC is the API layer between it. Giving you the ownership of those things while still giving you the benefit of having them set up for you as soon as you run the command line. I think there's a balance here where it's slightly less like if the Supabase method you described is 10 out of 10 efficiency, this is 9 out of 10 with none of the compromise on ownership.
Yeah, that's fair. I think, when you're making that trade-off, it really kind of comes down to like, what are the tools available and how much do you understand them? Because, I think for me, I don't know what I would do with NextAuth. Like and so some of the ramp up there is like maybe fast, probably fast. I don't know. I've never used these tools, but it's a lot of new things for me. Like my experience with TRPC is one episode's worth, and my experience with Prisma is like one project that I built that didn't end up hitting production. And so for me to move into these tools is probably fast. And if Create T3 app is rocking some killer docs, I'm super happy because I'd need to read those docs for Supabase too, or for Fauna or any of these other tools, right? So the thing I'm always looking at is you bring up really good points about scale, because that is fair. Like if you choose the wrong tool and it can't handle a burst, what do you do? Yeah, you like get in their support queue and hope for the best. Like, that sucks, right? So I do definitely hear that, and that is a concern that's well worth looking into. And then on the other side, I look at my own, like, what are the skills of the people working on this thing, and what's the fastest thing to ramp up on? And typically that's going to be the thing that does the most with the best docs. And so that's sort of where I start looking at too, because, and again, like, you're building a company. The things that you're building are a little more long-lived. I'm building marketing sites and demos. And so a lot of the things that I'm building aren't necessarily built for like longevity. They're not necessarily built for, like burst capacity is like a few thousand people open it to laugh at the fun thing. And that is it. So we do need to be mindful of that, but I'm also not building like mission critical things. If I build a site to troll Phil Hawksworth and too many people look at it and it falls over, I don't care. You know what I mean? Like but if I was doing that for like a conference registration site, I care very much. And so I think that's, again, just kind of getting into the incredible nuance of making these decisions around architecture and stuff.
It's my goal specifically to make this less nuanced by making the gap between, like, right now, it feels like the gap's been reduced from tools like these let me move way faster to tools like these are the ones I'm familiar with, and they let me personally move slightly faster because of that familiarity. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Nothing I ever do will be better than something like an individual developer is familiar with. But we've specifically picked the technologies we've picked to let you use a basic knowledge of TypeScript to build scalable full stack applications without any concern or compromise around your ownership. And that's the long-term hill I'm prepared to die on, is we can make these other tools pretty much always the wrong choice unless you're already familiar intimately with them. It's not because they are bad, but because you can get the same wins without compromising on the ownership.
And that's the upward spiral of dev, right? Is like, yes, you start with DHTML and then you get jQuery, and jQuery came with a lot of trade-offs, but it was way better than what was there before. And then we learned and we did something better than that, right? And I think that, you were talking about the pendulum swing, and I hear people talk about the, like, going in circles, and from the top view, the top down, it does look like going in circles.
Yes.
But if you go sideways, it is very much an upward spiral, because we're always solving the next set of problems. And I think you bring up what is a very, very valid challenge to the current set of solutions. The current set of solutions was, it is too hard to bring together all these disparate systems. We will build an all-in-one. Now, people have made the disparate systems really, really good. Like we've been talking about PlanetScale, it is killer. So it's not as hard to use PlanetScale as it is to go on AWS and spin up a MySQL database. So if that's true, then some of the value prop of a Firebase isn't really there anymore. And so then the next set of problems becomes what you're talking about. How do we get the benefits of this current crop of solutions without the trade-offs and create a next crop of solutions? And so I think we're seeing that right now with, this kind of sea change in people looking at what comes after React, and people looking at, why don't we go to serverless instead of managing all of these servers? And what you're doing,
Lambda
with T3
revolution is one of the biggest parts of this, like not having to think about infrastructure as computers that you own and worry about running, and instead thinking about infrastructure as where the code goes and when it runs. And that, like, it's yes, where can we reduce dimensions of problems? There was a huge dimension of problems around infrastructure that Lambda solved. There's another dimension of problems around CI/CD that Netlify pioneered solutions for early on that have been copied by everybody since. The idea that I could sign in with my GitHub repo and y'all handle everything from there was truly groundbreaking. The first time I saw that, I couldn't believe it. I was like, wait, I spent so much time setting up the CI at Twitch, and now I click sign in and it's better than the CI I set up. What the hell is going on? And those solutions that take like problems that are more configuration, less architecture, and removing that dimension entirely really excite me. And I have feared for a while now that it's easy to mistake something that handles CI for you in that elegant of a way for something that takes your ownership from you in like the data sense. And I want to be sure that like when people like picking Netlify or Vercel and picking PlanetScale are very different from picking Supabase or Firebase. Like there's a huge difference in what you're giving up when you make those choices. And I want to be very clear that there is a different tier of buy-in and a more significant like thought you should go through before making a decision on that side versus try out Vercel quick. If it turns out to not be the right thing, you just picked one of many ways to deploy your Lambdas. Move over to Netlify, move over to Flight Control, move over to AWS yourself. But those solutions are not, they are improvements to our workflows on top of things we can do ourselves versus entire architectures being sold to us with a black wall in front of them.
Right. Okay. Yep. I'm turned around to your point of view here. I agree. Because you don't want to get yourself into a situation where leaving is as hard as getting there in the first place was.
Absolutely.
And I think there's a huge difference between like there's vendor lock-in and then there's vendor lock-in, right? And then there's vendor lock-in, like the traditional enterprise consulting level vendor lock-in we won't even talk about. But if we're looking at like I've chosen a tool and that tool has made it so that it is a 100% turnover of my solution to move to a new solution, that feels like vendor lock-in. If the switch is, I got to drop in a couple different config files, I got to switch out what my database driver is or whatever it is, that's like a 10, 15, 20% max churn in your code base to swap to a new vendor. And it really does come into that, like, is the thing solving the problem so completely that I'm willing to make the investment in it? Because that's what happens when you invest in something like Next.js. If you go all in on all of their primitives, you now need to completely churn your code base to move to another framework.
Yep.
And that's not necessarily a bad thing. But you can also use something like Astro or Remix or Next.js with a more just component-based approach, and you don't go all the way into like the deep dark what's only possible with Next.js on Vercel because they built it that way, like those types of things that really do lead to lock-in, where you now have to like re-architect stuff, right? And so I think that figuring out how to draw those lines where you have a good instinct, and this is, again, we were talking about expertise, right? Mm-hmm. How do you build these instincts where you have that alarm go off that goes, ooh, I'm about to make a choice that's going to be expensive to undo.
Yep.
One of the leaders on my team has this idea about, like, in decision making, is it a one-way door or a two-way door? Like if you walk through this door and something goes wrong, can you just turn around and walk right back out? Or does it lock behind you and now you have a very expensive way to backtrack? And so that, figuring out where, especially for your org, and this is why every developer says it depends, right? Is because when you start asking these questions, it's like, well, okay, I would use Superbase if X, Y, and Z were true, right? And, and I would use Fauna if X, Y, Z were true. I would use PlanetScale if X, Y, Z are true. And the number of things that need to be true for tools that are more specialized, it gets really long. But that's a list of heuristics that you build into your own decision-making process. And then you just have to remember your familiarity is not the only reason to make a choice. And, if it's a personal project, cool. Do what you know. Doesn't matter if it's bad, right? I build bad stuff all the time because it's just for me. But when I'm building something for the company, I'm thinking about how many people have to maintain this. What do the people who will inherit this know? What's their familiarity level? What are the tools that are already in play? How much am I expanding the company's tool set by making this choice? Like, so many of these different factors that come in. But I really do like, I'm gonna take with me the idea of thinking about, like, how much of your ownership of something are you giving away by making certain choices.
Absolutely love this. And to quickly defend the services that do like this type of taking away the ownership, I think there's a ton of innovation around developer experience that can only happen in those places. Like, a lot of what makes Fullstack JAMStack style development so great are the innovations Next.js and Vercel did by tightly coupling those things. A lot of the workflows around databases that we've fallen in love with things like PlanetScale were originally innovated by Firebase, and the things that they enabled by locking all of that in together. The idea of data that updates itself on the client is still something that we're trying to like chase after in lots of other like workflows now. I think that it's important to look at what is happening in that world of like infrastructure buy-in and ownership that is irresponsible to jump on unless you have a really good reason for it. But you can see the things they make possible. And we in like the open source infrastructure world of modular pieces that like on my side, we build the frameworks and on your side, you build the infrastructure. We can make it so you don't have to make those compromises to have that developer experience. And that's my goal, is to learn the lessons those tightly coupled solutions prove and apply them other places. It's the Unix philosophy all over again. We've seen how operating systems can work if everything's pulled together correct. How good can they work if we replace all the parts with things that were optimized by the right person at the right time? And can we assemble that in a way that anybody can install off a USB drive? I think we can do that. Obviously, we couldn't do that for like the year of the Linux desktop will never happen, but the year of the modular tech stack is next year.
Yeah, we're going composable, everybody.
I'm so hyped.
Like for real. I think you're spot on there. And I think like tech stack also is a broad term because it's not just like the code that you're going to write. It's also the services you're going to use. You know, even the things that really tried to resist it, like WordPress, have gone headless. Shopify is headless. Like you can now just access them the same way that you would access anything else. And that is really, really powerful because it means, you know, the promise that was made years ago about like, oh, well, you know, you can build a website and then any service that you want to use, it just like it's hot swaps in, right? That was the promise of Gatsby. And we didn't like the way that Gatsby did it because it was big, heavy GraphQL for weird reasons. But it sort of delivered on this promise of, well, if you add the data plugin for this, and then swap it out for the data plugin for that, the code changes to switch from one system to another is just tweak your query. And that part was cool, but we didn't like all the trade-offs that came with it. So now when we're looking at what's next, I think we're starting to see like it's getting easier and easier to make these choices, and things like Prisma and TRPC, things like PlanetScale, things like serverless functions are starting to make some of that data normalization that enables this plug and play-ness of a truly like modular composable site is enabled because we're all starting to learn from each other and make better decisions about how to make data portable. And what I'm excited about is that we're not currently seeing people violently pull away from that, which is somewhat refreshing because that hasn't always been the case. Like a lot of times when companies start to smell that they're becoming interoperable, they do something really destructive and try to make something that's like only works on them and like is actively a little bit broken from the spec so that it's really painful to switch off. We haven't seen that yet, and I'm really hopeful that that trend continues.
Yeah, I definitely agree with the trend change. I haven't seen much that would be like, oh, that is miserable to move off, other than a few of these new database platforms. Like, I don't want to call out too many by name particularly, but Convix, you scare me. You very much scare me with what you're building there. I am pumped that the modular mindset seems to have really taken over. I credit serverless functions in particular for that. I think that we're still feeling the impact there, and the amount that I've personally changed my way of building as a result is unbelievable. And I think we're just starting to see the results of that now. It's kind of like I come from the game world, and we are now enough years out from when Breath of the Wild, the new Legend of Zelda game on the Switch happened, that we're starting to see the games made by people who had their worlds shaken by that game and had to rethink the way they do things. We're just seeing the result of people whose grounds were shaken by serverless functions and like React.js and the idea of these broken up pieces starting to build the next generation of tools on top of what we learned.
Yeah, 100%. That is it's so cheesy that every developer always signs off with like, I can't wait to see what you build. But like legitimately, every time somebody drops something where you can see someone really understood what is unlocked, not like how I can build the same things using new tools, but legitimately like this is now net new positive. It was not possible before. Oh, I get so excited. Like, it's just when Planet Scale dropped portals, for example, I was like, oh, right. When we got edge functions running on Netlify, that stuff. I'm like, just cannot stop spinning wheels on like, oh my God, now we can do this. Now we can do this. Now we can do this. And it is just so much fun to be part of the web when we're in an innovation wave like this. Where it, like you said, people realize that new things were possible and they're starting to build companies on new possibilities. And I think that part is really, truly incredible and unlocks so much fun for us as web devs, which I'm saying web devs and not front end devs, because I think we're too far back in the stack now with all these tools to call ourselves front end anymore. I think we're web devs now, and web experiences are whole ass applications. Like I said, it's not like the microservice spits out a front end. The web app is the application on top. And then you've got back end microservice applications that drive in the middle, right? Or that drive at the back. Absolutely. And all of that is very complex and very serious engineering work it's just different now than it was in 2015 or in 2005.
I absolutely agree. Sorry, chat distracted me with Cloudflare workers are going to replace Lambdas. I will wait till we have wrapped up here because I don't agree. I think workers are great and I love Edge stuff. And I think there's a lot of use cases that we can move from Lambda to Edge, but not a drop-in replacement. We're a long ways from that being realistic.
Yeah, I think, and they solve different problems, right?
Yes.
Like serverless functions are solving I want my logic to happen close to the data center. Mm-hmm. And edge functions are solving, I want my logic to happen close to the user. And I don't know, I feel like they're separate things.
I totally agree. I like Edge is bringing compute closer to your user. Lambda is bringing infra scaling blindly to your regions. It's Sorry to distract with that one. I totally agree though. And yeah, I'm pumped with how this wrapped up. I didn't expect we would agree this much about this many of these things. I am hyped and also totally agree. Couldn't be more excited for the future of where these tools are going, where companies like Netlify are pushing things. Oh, do you want to shout out the specific Netlify thing coming up before I forget?
Oh yeah. Let me do a quick shout out again to JAMStack Conf. The event is happening in person in San Francisco. We're super excited about it. It's the first in-person event we're throwing since 2019. I am going to be there myself, as well as like Sunil Pai is going to be there. We're going to have Ryan Carniato there, Zach Leatherman, Fred Schott from Astro, Jessica Janik from the Angular team. Like, we've got a whole bunch of people from the framework teams. We've got people from Planet Scale, Supabase, Zeta, Convex, Chisel Strike, like a bunch of new database people all coming in. And we're just going to be kind of talking at length about a lot of what Theo and I have been talking about. Like, the web there's been a tectonic shift in it, right? More is possible today than there ever was before. So if you want to get a ticket, you can go to jamstack.org/conf, and we would absolutely love to see you there. It's also online, but come hang out in person. It's going to be really fun. We like rented a building with a rooftop and stuff. So we're going to have live coding DJs out on the rooftop and all sorts of cool. Oh, we got a pen full of dogs. Like, a local rescue is bringing dogs so that we can all pet dogs. And if you live in San Francisco, you can take one home.
I will go.
Very
you've gotten me, and you can't promise free dogs and not expect me to show up.
Yeah, I'm super pumped about it. Like, we're putting a lot into this one. It's going to be really, really fun. And I'm also just so excited to see people. Like, I'm very much a remote worker, but I love the hallway track that happens at events. And I'm very much looking forward to this one. I'm sick of watching YouTube playlists and people calling that conferences. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. I do want to put on a very different online conference someday. T3 Conf will happen some point next year, and y'all should be hyped for that.
Nice.
But I absolutely agree. In person is incredibly hard to beat. And yeah, I am super hyped for the event. I will do my best to be there in person, and I hope a bunch of y'all show up as well. Definitely let us know if you're going to be there, and we'll do our best to meet you.
Yeah, super, super pumped. And somebody asked if the online event is free. Yeah, if you attend online, the tickets are free.
Great stuff. I just dropped you one more shout out in chat. So if anybody here for some reason isn't following Jason on Twitch already, please do. He's the pioneer of these more technical conversations on the platform. He was streaming for years before the software and game dev category even existed. So please make sure you give him a follow if you haven't already. One of the best channels on this damn site for learning all about all the cool things happening. In a lot of ways, it's like a slower version of like Fireship's 100-second videos, but he brings on the creator of the thing to talk about it too. So you get to like hear from the brain that made these new technologies, what's great about it, and how they recommend using it. So absolutely worth watching if you haven't already. Fantastic show.
Thank you very much.
Of course.
And thanks everybody for hanging out today. This was super fun.
Yeah, this was quite the crew. You went for almost 3 hours with us. I appreciate it a ton, man. Thank you so much.
Can you tell I'm starved for human attention?
Can you tell I am? That's why this works. It works great because we've annoyed our coworkers so much that we have to annoy hundreds of people online instead.
Yes, absolutely. My partner's in the next office over and she just sees me coming around the corner. She's like, just go. You can't. Go away. Close the door.
So relatable. Oh my God. God bless Twitter Spaces for giving me another place to do that, because I just need to like dump my brain sometimes, and y'all are incredible for that. So I appreciate every single person here and all the ones who are watching in the VOD in the future. Thank you all again. I'm going to BRB for a little bit to wrap up things on my side. I'll be live ranting about whatever else I have on my list in 10 or so minutes. So don't leave just yet. We'll be right back. Thank you again, Jason, so much. Any last words before I switch to the BRB?
Nah, thanks for hanging out. We'll see you online, everybody.
Of course. Go in BRB for a little bit.